Imagine standing at a Roman watchtower almost 2,000 years ago. Dense forests lie in front of you, fog drifts over the hills, somewhere a branch cracks in the undergrowth. Behind you, the world of Rome begins with streets, castles, merchants, soldiers, laws, and an order that stretches over large parts of Europe. But before you begins a territory that Rome has never been able to fully dominate. This is exactly where the limes ran. But was the limes really a border that protected Rome from its enemies? Or was it more of a sign that even the most powerful empire of antiquity would eventually reach its limits? Write your opinion in the comments. Was the limes a symbol of strength or an admission of weakness for Rome? In this video, we travel back to the edge of the Roman Empire. We see how the limes was formed, how soldiers lived there, how traders, farmers, and families mastered their everyday lives in the shadow of the castles, and why this border could not last forever in the end. So be sure to stick with it until the end, because the history of the limes is not only about walls, towers, and Roman soldiers. It tells of power, fear, control, trade, encounters, and the big question of how far an empire can really reach. If you like historical topics, feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so that you don't miss any more exciting journeys into the past. Chapter 1: The Frontier of a World Empire. The limes is one of the most impressive traces that the Roman Empire left behind in Europe. Anyone who thinks of this border today may first see reconstructed wooden towers, palisades, ditches, ramparts, or stone wall remains. But the limes was much more than a series of buildings. It was a sign of Roman power, a military security system, an economic area, a contact zone, and at the same time a visible expression of the fact that even a world empire like Rome could not grow limitlessly. In its history, great questions of antiquity are condensed. How does an empire protect its external borders? How do you control people, goods, and movements across huge spaces? How do you live in a place where two worlds meet, mix, mistrust, and sometimes fight? The Roman Empire had reached an enormous extent over centuries. Rome's influence ranged from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the Rhine and Danube. This empire had been held together not only by military force, but also by roads, cities, administration, law, trade, taxes, and an amazing ability to integrate foreign regions into the Roman order. Rome was not equally present everywhere, but everywhere it tried to make control visible. Roads connected garrisons with cities, castles secured important roads, officials administered provinces, coins carried the image of the emperor to remote areas. The power of Rome was therefore not only a question of legions, but also a question of organization. But the larger this empire became, the more urgently the question of its limits arose. In Rome's early history, expansion had been almost a matter of course. One victory led to another, one province became the starting point for new conquests, and military glory was closely linked to political power. For Roman generals and emperors, the expansion of the empire was often a means of gaining prestige and outshining internal opponents. But reality set limits to this logic. Some landscapes were difficult to control, some enemies could not be permanently subdued, and some conquests cost more than they earned. At some point, Rome had to decide where it wanted to concentrate its forces, and where a border made more sense than another campaign. The limes was created precisely from this tension between aspiration and reality. It was not a single structure that was fully planned and erected at any given time. Rather, it developed step by step. Initially, it was about military presence at important points, road connections, outposts, guard posts, and forts. Later, individual sections were strengthened. Wooden palisades, ditches, ramparts, and towers were added. In some regions, stone walls were built, in others the border remained more open. So the limes was not the same everywhere. It adapted to the landscape, the threat situation, and political needs. Particularly well known is the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes, which ran through parts of today's Germany. It connected the Rhine with the Danube and secured an area that was strategically important for Rome. The Rhine and Danube were natural borders, but between them lay an area of military and economic importance. By securing this territory, Rome was able to better connect its provinces, facilitate troop movements, and protect the hinterland. The limes was thus not only a line of defense against attacks from outside, but also an instrument to stabilize Roman rule internally. However, it would be wrong to understand the limes as an impenetrable wall. It was not like a modern state border with fixed checkpoints in today's sense. Nor was it designed everywhere to stop large armies permanently. Rather, its task was to direct, monitor, and control movements. Small groups should not be able to enter unnoticed. Traders should take advantage of certain transitions. News of enemy movements should be passed on quickly. The soldiers on the limes were to observe, report, deter, and in an emergency, gain time until larger troop formations could intervene. Thus, the limes was also a communication system. The watchtowers were often positioned in such a way that visual contact with the nearest tower was possible. Signals could be passed on, for example through smoke, fire, or other signs. Behind the borderline were forts where auxiliary troops were stationed. These soldiers were often not legionnaires in the strict sense, but members of the so-called auxiliary troops. They came from different parts of the empire and took on important tasks at the borders. Their service was hard, often monotonous, and yet of great importance. They patrolled, guarded crossings, repaired facilities, controlled routes, and kept in touch with the local population. At this point, it becomes clear that the limes cannot only be understood in military terms. Settlements were built where soldiers were stationed. Merchants came to supply the garrisons. Craftsmen offered their services, and families lived near the camps. Inns, workshops, markets, and small sanctuaries shaped life in the fort villages. The border was thus also a place of everyday life. People were born, worked, prayed, loved, argued, and died there. For them, the limes was not only a symbol of imperial politics, but the framework of their daily lives. At the same time, the limes was a zone of encounter between Romans and Germanic tribes. Even though the Roman sources often describe the people on the other side of the border as strange, wild, or dangerous, the reality was more complex. There was trade, exchange, and personal contacts. Germanic groups were able to purchase Roman goods, such as ceramics, metal objects, jewelry, or wine. Conversely, Rome was interested in raw materials, animals, labor, and information from the areas on the other side of the border. Some people crossed the limes regularly, others may even have served in the Roman military or worked near the border. So the border divided, but it also connected. It is precisely this double function that makes the limes so fascinating. It was a tool of control, but not an absolute dividing line. Rome wanted to create order, but had to deal with the reality of an open border landscape. Those responsible had to decide who they trusted, who they let through, who they observed, and when military force became necessary. This meant constant adaptation. The limes was not a rigid structure, but a living system that only functioned as long as there were enough soldiers, money, administration, and political will. As a symbol, the limes was particularly powerful. He showed the inhabitants of the provinces that Rome was present. He made visible where the Roman order began and where it ended. He was able to convey security to the people within the empire. For people outside, it could be a deterrent, but it could also trigger curiosity and attraction. Because beyond this border was not simply a hostile world. There were neighbors, trading partners, opponents, and possible allies. The Roman border has therefore always been a political space. The history of the limes thus tells not only of Roman strength. It also tells of Roman borders in a figurative sense. Because an empire that fortifies a border recognizes that it cannot control everything. The limes was a sign of power because Rome had the means to build huge border systems, station soldiers, and organize landscapes. At the same time, it was an admission that expansion was not possible indefinitely. Rome had to choose, secure, administer, and sometimes do without. This is precisely where the deeper meaning of the limes lies. It was not simply the end of the Roman world, but a space in which the great strengths and weaknesses of the empire were revealed. Organization, technology, military, and administration made it possible. But political crises, economic burdens, external attacks, and internal power struggles could endanger him. As long as the empire was strong enough, the limes acted like a fixed line of order. As Rome weakened, it became apparent how vulnerable this order was. The limes was thus border, stage, and mirror at the same time. Border, because he distinguished spaces from each other. Stage, because soldiers, traders, farmers, civil servants, and foreign groups met on it. Spiegel, because it made visible how Rome thought about power, security, and control. If you want to understand its history, you have to look beyond walls and towers. One has to ask why Rome needed this border, how it worked, who lived on it, and why it could not exist permanently in the end. At the beginning of this story is an empire that was so powerful that it carried its order to the edges of Europe. But it was precisely there, at these edges, that it became apparent that power always means limitation. The limes was the visible sign of this realization. It marked not only the end of a province, but also the point at which Rome had to ask itself a question. How far can an empire go before it begins to fail because of its own greatness? Chapter 2: Rome and the Germanic Territories. When Rome turned its gaze to the north, it did not encounter an empty wilderness, but a diverse world of tribes, settlements, trade routes, power groups, and local power structures. The Roman authors often described these areas as dark, harsh, and dangerous. Dense forests, swamps, cold winters, and landscapes that were difficult to access shaped the image of Germania in their imagination. But this depiction was never free of Roman prejudices. For many Romans, everything that lay outside their own order was initially foreign and disordered. They saw themselves as bearers of law, city life, discipline, and civilization. The people on the other side of the Rhine and Danube, on the other hand, appeared to them as unpredictable, warlike, and difficult to control. It was precisely this perception that shaped Roman policy towards the Germanic territories for a long time. However, the Germanic world was by no means a unified bloc. There was not one Germania and not one Germanic people. Rather, numerous groups lived there with their own names, leaders, alliances, and enmities. Tribes such as the Cherusci, Chatti, Marcomanni, Suebi, Bructeri, or Batavi had different relationships with each other and with Rome. Some groups fought against the Romans, others formed alliances, and still others served as auxiliary troops in the Roman army. Friendship and enmity could change quickly. A leader who was a Roman ally today could become an opponent tomorrow if power interests, personal honor, or internal tribal conflicts demanded it. For Rome, it was precisely this fragmentation that made the situation both dangerous and useful. It was dangerous because the political situation was constantly changing. It was useful because Rome could play off individual groups against each other. Long before the limes was created as a fortified borderline, there were intensive contacts between Romans and the people north of the Alps. Trade played a central role in this. Roman goods reached far beyond the borders of the empire. Wine, ceramics, glass, metal goods, jewelry, and coins found their way into Germanic settlements. Such items were not only useful, but also signs of prestige. Those who owned Roman luxury goods could make their rank within their own community visible. For Germanic leaders, Roman gifts, weapons, or valuable vessels were political means. They strengthened their authority, rewarded followers, and showed that they had access to a powerful world. Conversely, the Romans were interested in cattle, skins, amber, slaves, raw materials, and military support. So the exchange was not one-sided. Both sides benefited, even if the balance of power was unequal. In addition to trade, military contacts were decisive. Rome was an empire that defined its security strongly through military presence. The Rhine and Danube became important lines of Roman control because they formed natural obstacles and were at the same time transport routes. Warehouses, roads, and supply networks were built on its banks. From there, Roman troops could advance into the Germanic territories, but also protect the provinces. Especially since the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar, the Rhine had become a political and symbolic border. In his reports, Caesar had portrayed the Germanic tribes as dangerous warriors who could be a threat to Gaul and thus to Rome. This portrayal helped him justify his campaigns and increase his fame. This already shows how closely Roman border policy was linked to propaganda. For Rome, the Germanic territories were interesting for several reasons. Militarily, the aim was to prevent enemy groups from invading Roman territory. Economically, the north offered raw materials and trade opportunities. Politically, successful campaigns could increase the fame of a general or emperor. At the same time, it was a matter of security for the provinces that had already been conquered. Gaul was extremely important for Rome. The region brought taxes, soldiers, and economic revenues. When Germanic groups crossed the Rhine and caused unrest, this endangered not only local settlements, but also the reputation of Roman rule. An empire that promised protection had to show that it could defend its subjects. But the attempt to permanently dominate Germanic territories posed major problems for Rome. The landscape was very different from many regions that Rome had successfully integrated. There were fewer cities, fewer existing administrative structures, and fewer central centers of power to take over. In Gaul, Greece, or Asia Minor, Rome was often able to fall back on existing cities, elites, and transport routes. In large parts of Germania, this was more difficult. The settlement structures were more fragmented, and political authority was often based on personal allegiance, military success, and family ties. If Rome supported a leader, it did not automatically mean that his entire community accepted Roman rule permanently. In addition, Roman armies were vulnerable in the Germanic territories. The legions were excellently organized, disciplined, and often superior in open combat. But in dense forests, confusing terrain, and poor paths, their strengths could be limited. Long supply routes became a risk. Marching columns could be attacked. Opponents who were familiar with the area could retreat, reappear, and wear down Roman units. Rome was able to achieve victories, carry out punitive expeditions, and temporarily control individual areas. But lasting domination demanded more than military superiority. It demanded administration, infrastructure, local cooperation, and political stability. Nevertheless, Rome repeatedly tried to exert influence beyond the Rhine and Danube. Especially under Emperor Augustus, the idea of integrating Germania more strongly into the empire was pursued. Augustus wanted to order and secure the empire and at the same time legitimize his rule through successes. The Roman expansion to the north fitted into this thinking. Commanders such as Drusus and Tiberius carried out military operations, established bases, and expanded connections. At times, Rome seemed to be on the way to bringing the area between the Rhine and Elbe more under control. But this control remained fragile. It was based on military presence, local alliances, and the assumption that Germanic elites would be willing to allow themselves to be permanently integrated into Roman structures. This assumption proved to be dangerous. Many Germanic leaders knew the Roman world well. Some had served in the Roman army, learned Latin, or received Roman citizenship. But it was precisely because of this that they also understood the strengths and weaknesses of Rome. They knew how Roman troops marched, how orders worked, and how much Rome depended on order and predictability. The most famous among them was Arminius, a Cheruscan nobleman who had gained experience in Roman service and later became Rome's decisive opponent. His story shows how closely connection and resistance could be interwoven. Romanization did not automatically mean loyalty. Those who knew Rome could also fight Rome better. For the Germanic groups, Rome was both a threat and an opportunity. Proximity to the Reich could bring wealth, but also dependency. Roman alliances could strengthen individual leaders, but they could create distrust within a tribe. Some saw Rome as a powerful partner, others as a danger to their own freedom and honor. Freedom must not be understood in the modern sense. For Germanic warrior elites, it meant above all independence from foreign rule, the right to make their own decisions, their own leaders, and their own military campaigns. From their point of view, Roman order could have the effect of submission, even if it was associated with gifts, trade, and titles. On the Roman side, on the other hand, the attitude fluctuated between fascination, contempt, and fear. Germanic warriors were considered brave, physically strong and dangerous, but from a Roman point of view often undisciplined. Roman writers used this image for their own purposes. Sometimes they portrayed Germanic tribes as savage barbarians to emphasize Roman superiority. Sometimes they praised their simplicity and harshness to criticize the alleged moral weakness of their own society. The image of the Germanic tribes was therefore not only a description, but also a mirror of Roman self-interpretation. When Romans wrote about Germanic tribes, they often wrote about their own fears, ideals, and political debates at the same time. The encounter between Rome and the Germanic territories was therefore never simply a story of attack and defense. It was a permanent struggle for influence, security, recognition, and control. The border was created not because two completely separate worlds faced each other, but because they were too closely connected to ignore each other and too differently organized to grow together easily. Rome needed stability, predictable taxes, safe transport routes, and reliable alliances. Many Germanic groups, on the other hand, lived in more flexible power structures, in which personal ties, war success, and tribal interests were often more important than permanent administration. Out of this tension, the limes later developed. It was not the beginning of relations between Rome and Germania, but a response to long experiences with trade, war, diplomacy, and failed plans for conquest. Rome had learned that direct rule beyond certain lines could cause high costs. At the same time, it did not want to leave the Germanic territories completely to themselves, because what happened there could have an impact on the Roman provinces. The limes therefore became a middle ground. It was intended to create distance without ending contacts. It was intended to protect without preventing any movement. It was intended to make Roman power visible without Rome having to control every village on the other side of the border. Thus, there were no simple opposites on the edge of the empire. Here Rome, there the barbarians. Order here, chaos there. The reality was much more human and much more complicated. There was mistrust and violence, but also trade and cooperation. There was Roman arrogance, but also Roman dependence on local allies. There was Germanic resistance, but also Germanic interest in Roman goods, titles, and opportunities. The border, which later became visible as the limes, grew out of precisely this multi-layered relationship. So before towers, palisades, and castles shaped the landscape, an invisible border already existed in people's minds. For Rome, the Germanic territories marked a challenge to its own claim to power. For many Germanic groups, Rome was an overpowering neighbor, whose proximity brought wealth, danger, and political changes. The limes eventually became the visible expression of this relationship. He showed that Rome could not ignore the Germanic world, but it could not completely dominate it either. This is precisely the historical significance of this border. It arose from encounter, from conflict, from mutual dependence, and from the recognition that power is most difficult where it encounters people who cannot be easily classified. Chapter 3. After the Battle of Varus. The Battle of Varus in the year 9 AD is one of those events that had an impact far beyond the moment. 3 Roman legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, were destroyed in the forests and swamps of Germania. For Rome, this defeat was not only a military shock, but a deep political and psychological shock. An empire that had become accustomed to expanding its order suddenly had to learn that its power was not enforceable everywhere. The catastrophe did not affect any remote unit, but a significant part of the Roman forces on the Rhine. Legions were not simply interchangeable troop formations. They bore names, traditions, symbols, and pride. When legions perished, it was an attack on the self-image of the empire. Before the battle, Rome had tried to integrate Germania more closely into its ruling system. Under Emperor Augustus, the idea of permanently controlling the area between the Rhine and the Elbe had grown. Military advances, diplomatic contacts, bases, and administrative elements were to create a new Roman order. Varus was not only active as a general in Germania, but also as an administrator. That was exactly what was decisive. Rome apparently increasingly treated parts of Germania as if they were already pacified territory. Taxes, jurisdiction, and Roman claims were introduced or at least prepared. What seemed like order to Rome could be perceived as subjugation by Germanic groups. The resistance did not arise from a sudden outbreak of fierce hostility, but from a political situation in which Rome expanded its control and local elites had to decide whether to benefit from it or to stand up against it. Arminius played a key role in this development. He came from the Cheruscan nobility, knew the Roman world, and had served in the Roman military. He understood Roman discipline, Roman marching order, and Roman trust in ways of command. It was precisely this proximity to Rome that made him dangerous. He was not an inexperienced opponent, but someone who knew how Roman power worked. Arminius could trade between the worlds. For the Romans, he initially appeared as an ally, perhaps even as a reliable man from a local ruling class. For Germanic groups, he could become the organizer of a resistance that brought together different interests. His achievement was not only in military ambush, but in political preparation. This is because Germanic tribes and followers rarely acted permanently as a unit. They had to be convinced, connected, or at least aligned with a goal for a common moment. The ambush against Varus was therefore more than a battle. It was the result of deception, local knowledge, patience, and a keen sense of Roman weaknesses. The Roman troops moved through difficult terrain, burdened by entourage, companions, and equipment. They did not march in an ideal battle order, but were vulnerable. Rain, mud, forests, and narrow paths made any orderly reaction difficult. The Germanic fighters were able to attack, retreat, and strike again. For the legions, who represented a formidable force in the open field, the landscape itself became the enemy. The Roman army lived from order, overview, and closed formation. In the area of the Battle of Varus, precisely these conditions disintegrated. A military machine became a long, vulnerable column. When the news reached Rome, the effect was enormous. Augustus is said to have been deeply shaken. Even if later reports may be dramatized, there is no doubt that the defeat was felt to be exceptionally difficult. 3 legions were lost, their eagle standards captured, numerous soldiers killed or captured. The standards were of enormous symbolic importance for Rome. They embodied the honor of unity and thus the honor of the empire. Their loss was not only practical, but morally devastating. Rome could accept defeats, but this defeat raised the question of whether the entire Germania policy had failed. Nevertheless, Rome did not collapse. The empire had large resources, experienced commanders, and the ability to respond to crises. On the Rhine, the defensive measures were strengthened. It was necessary to prevent Germanic groups from taking advantage of the defeat and invading the Roman provinces. The fear was real, because Gaul was of central importance to Rome. If the unrest had spread to the Gallic provinces, a military catastrophe could have turned into a political crisis for the entire West. Therefore, after the Battle of Varus, the first thing to do was to stabilize. Rome had to show that the border was not open and that the empire remained capable of acting despite the defeat. In the following years, Roman generals undertook new operations in Germania. In particular, Germanicus, the adopted son of the later Emperor Tiberius, led campaigns that also served to restore Roman honor. It was a matter of regaining the lost standards, burying the fallen, punishing opponents, and not completely abandoning the Roman claim. These campaigns showed that Rome was still militarily capable of penetrating deep into Germania. Arminius was put under pressure, Germanic groups were defeated, territories were devastated, and individual successes were achieved. But the crucial question remained: did Rome really want to conquer and administer this country permanently? Under Tiberius, the answer increasingly shifted towards caution. Tiberius was not a weak ruler, but he thought more soberly than many generals who sought glory. A permanent conquest of Germania would have caused enormous costs. They would have had to build roads, secure camps, set up administration, involve local elites, and constantly provide troops. The benefit was uncertain. Germania promised less direct income than richer provinces in the east or south. There was no dense urban infrastructure that Rome could simply take over. The military effort was not in a secure proportion to the profit. Thus, in retrospect, the Battle of Varus became a turning point because it forced Rome to distinguish between ambition and reason. The Roman strategy did not change from one day to the next, but the basic direction became clearer. The Rhine remained a decisive line. Instead of making all of Germania up to the Elbe a province, Rome concentrated more on securing its existing territories. This did not mean that Rome was powerless on the other side of the Rhine. Diplomacy, punitive expeditions, alliances, trade, and influence remained important tools. Rome could play Germanic groups off against each other, support friendly leaders, or punish enemy groups militarily. But direct, permanent rule was viewed more cautiously. This is exactly where the connection to the later limes lies. The Battle of Varus did not immediately create the limes as it is later known, but it changed the way of thinking that could give rise to border systems. Rome had to realize that control did not always have to be achieved by conquest. It was also possible to secure, monitor, direct, and deter. A border could make more political sense than an endless campaign. The limes was later an expression of this realization. It was not just a building, but a strategic response to the experience that Rome was strong, but could not rule everywhere at the same time. For the Germanic groups, the Battle of Varus also had far-reaching consequences. It showed that Rome could be defeated when conditions were favorable and when local forces worked together. But the victory did not lead to a permanent Germanic empire. Arminius remained a prominent figure, but his power was limited. After the joint fight, old rivalries resurfaced. Some Germanic elites may have feared not only Rome, but also an overly powerful Arminius. Finally, he was murdered by his own relatives. This development shows that resistance to Rome did not automatically mean political unity. The Germanic world remained diverse, mobile, and characterized by internal power struggles. For Rome, this fragmentation was an advantage. Even after the defeat, the empire was able to exert influence because there was no closed Germanic counterpower. The border thus remained a space of permanent politics. Rome not only had to deploy soldiers, but also cultivate relationships, gather information, and observe conflicts across the border. The later limes was therefore never just a line against an enemy. He was part of a larger system of diplomacy, secret knowledge, trade, control, and military readiness. The memory of the Battle of Varus remained alive for a long time. It became a symbol of the danger of Germania and of the risks of overstretched power. For Roman authors, it was an example of what happened when trust, terrain, arrogance, and political miscalculation came together. Varus was often portrayed as a warning figure, as a man who had underestimated the situation and misjudged his opponent. But to blame him alone does not go far enough. Behind the catastrophe was a larger imperial illusion, the assumption that Roman order could be introduced everywhere in a similar way. After the Battle of Varus, Rome began to think differently about its power on the Rhine and later on other border areas. Not every area had to become a province. Not every threat demanded conquest. Sometimes it was wiser to create a controlled border, secure crossings, and conserve one's own strength. The limes later became just such an instrument. He stood for Roman strength because he made organization and presence visible. But in its origin there was also the memory of a defeat that had taught Rome to be more careful. Thus, the Battle of Varus seems like a shadow over the entire history of the limes. Without them, it is hard to understand why Rome did not simply march further east in Germania. She made it clear that power is not only measured by the number of legions, but by the ability to correctly assess landscapes, people, and political realities. Rome had learned in Germania that military superiority becomes vulnerable if it is based on false assumptions. Over time, a new border policy emerged from this experience. The limes was therefore also a monument to Roman learning. He showed that the empire could not only strike back after a catastrophe, but also change its strategy. The border, which later received towers, palisades, forts and paths, began in a way at the moment when Rome understood that the dream of a province of Germania between the Rhine and the Elbe was too expensive, too risky and perhaps impossible. Chapter 4. The Formation of the Limes. The limes was not created in a single moment. It was not a building ordered by an emperor in one day and then erected according to a fixed overall plan. Its creation was a long process, marked by military experience, political caution, economic interests, and the constant question of how Rome could secure its power on the fringes of the empire. This is precisely where its peculiarity lies. The limes was not just a wall, but the result of decades of adaptation. It grew out of paths, camps, sentinels, patrol routes and border areas until it became an ever-denser system of control. After the experiences in Germania, and especially after the Battle of Varus, Rome had to reorganize its strategy. The idea of permanently dominating the area up to the Elbe lost its persuasiveness. But this did not mean that Rome withdrew completely or renounced influence. The Rhine remained a powerful natural border, as did the Danube further south. Both rivers were militarily valuable because they made movements more difficult and could also be used as transport routes. But between the Rhine and the Danube, there was an area that was strategically important. Those who controlled this area were able to improve the connection between the Roman provinces, move troops more quickly and relieve endangered border sections. So gradually the idea arose not only to stand by rivers, but to draw our own borderline through the country. In the beginning, there were usually no large fortifications, but military necessities. Roman troops needed safe routes from which to operate. They laid out roads, built marching camps, set up smaller posts and occupied important heights, valleys and crossings. A border had to be seen and reached first. Before they could be attached, they had to be measured, walked on and understood. Roman military planning was surprisingly practical. Attention was paid to sight lines, water points, transport routes, supply options, and the location to neighboring forts. The limes was therefore never just a straight line on a map. He was inscribed in the landscape. The Roman soldiers were not only fighters, but also construction workers, surveyors, road builders, and craftsmen. They could build camps, dig trenches, cut wood, work stones, and pave paths. The Roman army was a technical organization. Where it stayed longer, it transformed the environment. A provisional camp could be turned into a permanent fort. A military road could be created from a beaten path. An observation point could become a watchtower. This ability to transform military presence into solid infrastructure was one of Rome's great strengths. The limes was not only defended, it was built, managed, and constantly repaired. This development can be seen particularly well in the area of the later Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes. Initially, the Romans secured spaces that were important for the connection between the Rhine and the Danube. The aim was also to better control the so-called angle between the two rivers. A pure river border would have meant that Roman troops would have had to take long detours. An advanced land border shortened distances and created military depth. So Roma didn't just think defensively. The limes was not only intended to ward off attacks, but also to enable mobility. It was both a line of protection and an organizational line. Over time, the border fortifications became more visible. Where posts and patrols had initially sufficed, watchtowers were built. These towers were often positioned in such a way that their crews could see the next tower. This made it possible to pass on a message faster than a single rider could have carried it over long distances. Smoke, fire, horn signals, or other signs could trigger an alarm in an emergency. A single tower was not militarily strong enough to stop a major attack. But he was able to observe, report, and gain time. That was exactly what was decisive. The limes was an early warning system in many sections. Later, palisades, ditches, and ramparts were added. These facilities had several functions. They marked the border clearly visible. They made it difficult to cross the border secretly. They directed people to certain passages. But they also showed everyone who approached that Roman order began here. A palisade was not just wood in the ground. It was a political statement. She said, "The power of the emperor reaches as far as this. Anyone who crosses this line enters a controlled space." For traders, travelers, messengers, or local groups, this meant that they should not just pass anywhere, but at certain places, under the eyes of Roman soldiers. The construction of such facilities required enormous work. Wood had to be felled, transported, and placed in the ground. Ditches had to be dug, earth had to be piled up into ramparts, towers had to be erected, and paths had to be laid out. In some areas, the soils were difficult. In others, mountain ranges, valleys, or forests had to be taken into account. The Roman military was able to handle such tasks, but they were never completed. Wood rotted, storms damaged facilities, paths had to be repaired, and towers renewed. The limes was therefore a permanent work project. Its existence depended on constant care. Behind the visible borderline were forts. They were the actual military bases. Soldiers were housed there, weapons, supplies, and equipment were stored there. Commanders sat there, orders were received and passed on there. The forts were of different sizes. Some housed smaller units, others larger horsemen or infantry troops. They formed a network that held the border region together. They were used to send out patrols, supply watchtowers, secure roads, and monitor contacts. Without these forts, palisades, and towers would have been mere signs. Only the stationed troops made the border effective. The formation of the limes was closely linked to the development of the Roman provinces. A border not only protects against external opponents, it also places the country behind it. In the Roman provinces, roads, estates, markets, and administrative structures were built. People were supposed to pay taxes, trade, and live under Roman law. This required security. When farmers tilled their fields, merchants transported their goods, and officials collected taxes, the state had to offer credible protection. The limes was therefore also a prerequisite for economic stability. It protected not only soldiers' camps, but the entire Roman habitat near the border. At the same time, the border attracted people. They needed food, clothing, tools, animals, repairs, entertainment, and services. Merchants settled, craftsmen opened workshops, families lived near the castles. Civilian life arose from military infrastructure. Fort villages grew, streets became busier, markets emerged. The limes was therefore not a dead line at the edge of the world, but a space full of movement. It was precisely because Rome wanted to control that places of exchange emerged. For the people on the other side of the border, the limes remained ambivalent. It could appear threatening because it made Roman power visible, but he was also able to open up opportunities. Those who wanted to trade goods found buyers at the border crossings. Anyone looking for political support could contact Roman authorities. Anyone who wanted to serve as a mercenary or auxiliary soldier could find access to the Roman world via these border areas. The border made differences visible, but it did not completely cut off relationships. In practice, the limes was more permeable than the image of a closed wall suggests. Politically, the limes fulfilled another function. He helped the emperors to demonstrate order. An emperor had to show that he could protect the empire. Borders were places where imperial power was particularly visible. Inscriptions, building programs, troop deployments, and military inspections connected the border with the rule in Rome. When an emperor had border fortifications expanded, this could be seen as a sign of his care and strength. People in the provinces were to see that the emperor not only existed in Rome, but was also present on the outermost fringes of the empire. The formation of the limes was also a sign of a changed Roman way of thinking. The great era of unlimited expansion was not simply over, but Rome began to distinguish more strongly which areas could be controlled in the long term and which were not. A fortified frontier did not mean weakness alone. It meant planning. It showed that Rome wanted to put its forces in order. But it also contained the silent acknowledgement that there was an outside that was not fully absorbed into the realm. The limes was thus both a self-confident demonstration of power and cautious limitation. The further the border system developed, the more it became part of everyday life. For the soldiers it was a place of duty, for traders an economic area, for farmers a promise of protection, for Germanic groups a contact zone, and for the Roman administration an instrument of order. No one who lived there saw the limes only as an abstract line. It consisted of sounds, smells, paths, orders, markets, controls, encounters, and uncertainties. In the morning, soldiers were able to look for movements in the forest on a tower. A few hours later, a trader was able to cross the border with permission. In the evening, wine was served in a fort village, while somewhere a messenger brought a message to the next post. So the limes grew from many small decisions. A tower here, a fort there, a path through the forest, a palisade along an open road, a ditch in an endangered place. Military practice became border policy. Provisional security became a system. And a system became a symbol that is still associated with the Roman presence in Central Europe today. The formation of the limes shows how Rome organized its power, not only through battles, but through patience, architecture, management, and the ability to structure spaces permanently. But it also shows that this power was not a matter of course. It had to be renewed day after day. Every tower had to be occupied, every street secured, every palisade repaired, and every fort supplied. The limes was not a finished monument, but a living mechanism. As long as Rome filled it with people, money, and political will, it could function. As soon as these forces subsided, it became apparent that even the strongest border is only as stable as the empire that stands behind it. Chapter 5. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian Limes. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian Limes is the most famous section of the Roman border fortifications in present-day Germany. When people talk about the limes today, many people first think of this line, which once stretched across forests, mountain ranges, valleys, and open landscapes. It connected the Rhine region with the Danube and marked the edge of Roman rule over a long distance. But here, too, the limes was not simply a wall that cleanly separated two worlds from each other. It was a multi-layered border system that combined military control, political symbolism, economic life, and human encounters. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes is a particularly good example of how Rome organized its power in a difficult border landscape. The name refers to two Roman provincial areas. Upper Germania lay west and northwest of the border, Rhaetia further south and southeast. Both regions were of great importance to Rome because they secured important connections between the Rhine, the Danube, and the Alpine region. The Roman Empire thought in terms of transport routes, supply axes, and military movements. For Rome, a border was never just a line against enemies, but always part of a larger network of roads, camps, cities, and administrative places. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes served to order this area and to better connect the Roman provinces. Its course was impressive. It began in the area of the Rhine, passed through areas of today's Hesse, Baden-Württemberg, and Bavaria, and finally reached the Danube. It did not always run along natural obstacles. This is precisely what made him special. While the Rhine and Danube formed clear and easily recognizable boundary lines as rivers, this section of the limes led overland. He cut through landscapes, followed heights, used lines of sight, and connected militarily important points. In some sections, its course seems almost surprisingly straightforward, which shows how consciously and systematically Roman surveyors proceeded. The Romans wanted to create a border that not only followed the landscape, but made the landscape controllable. The emergence of this border system was closely linked to the Roman decision to secure the area between the Rhine and the Danube more strongly. For Rome, this space was strategically valuable. If only rivers had been relied on as borders, some connections would have remained long and cumbersome. An advanced land border shortened distances, facilitated troop movements, and protected the hinterland. It created a controlled space in which streets, manors, castles, and settlements could be built. The limes was therefore not only a reaction to threats, but also a means of making Roman life possible near the border. In Upper Germania, the border long consisted of a combination of palisade, ditch, rampart, watchtowers, and forts. In Rhaetia, a stone wall was later developed in parts, which was even more reminiscent of a fixed border marking. These differences show that the limes was not a uniform structure. Rome adapted its installations to the terrain, material, military situation, and administrative decisions. Where a more permanent or symbolically stronger solution was desired, stone was used. The decisive factor was not that the same thing was built everywhere, but that the system worked as a whole. The watchtowers formed the eyes of the border. From them, soldiers observed the apron. They paid attention to movements, smoke signals, strange groups, traders, cattle drives, or possible attackers. Many towers were positioned in such a way that they had visual contact with each other. This allowed messages to be passed on. A single tower was not a bulwark against a large army, but it was an important element of surveillance. The soldiers there lived in a mixture of routine and tension. Days could pass uneventfully, but a report could be necessary at any time. The view of the landscape was part of their service, and it was precisely this constant observation that made the limes effective. Behind the towers were the forts. They were the military backbone of the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes. Auxiliary troops were stationed there, infantry and cavalry, depending on the situation and task. These troops could carry out patrols, supply guards, secure roads, and move out in case of danger. Forts such as Salzburg, Aalen, Zugmontel, Osterburken, or Weissenberg are well-known names today because they show particularly impressively how Roman military architecture functioned in the border region. But for the people of antiquity, such places were not monuments, but working and living spaces. There, orders were given, equipment was repaired, supplies were stored, animals were cared for, letters were written, and decisions were made. The Salzburg is one of the most famous examples today because it has been reconstructed and gives an impression of what a Roman fort might have looked like. But each fort was part of a larger system. It was not isolated, but was connected to other military sites by roads. These roads were decisive. Without them, the limes could not have worked. Troops had to be moved quickly, supplies had to arrive reliably, messages had to be forwarded. Roman military power was not only based on swords and shields, but on logistics. A well-supplied border was stronger than a fortification that was difficult to reach. Fort villages were built around the forts. Traders, craftsmen, innkeepers, family members, former soldiers, and people who benefited from the proximity to the military lived there. The soldiers needed food, clothing, tools, shoes, ceramics, weapons repairs, and entertainment. This demand created economic opportunities. Thus, civilian settlements grew in many places, which were closely linked to the military. The limes was therefore also an engine of regional development. Where Rome stationed its soldiers, markets, workshops, and new forms of everyday life emerged. However, the border was not only directed inwards. It also regulated contact with the outside world. Germanic groups beyond the limes were not simply cut off. They could trade, receive gifts, exchange information, or act as political partners. Certain transitions allowed controlled movements. For Rome, it was important not to prevent any connection, but to make it controllable. A completely closed border area would have destroyed economic opportunities and made political contacts more difficult. A completely open border area, on the other hand, would have been difficult to control. The limes sought the middle ground between permeability and surveillance. For the Germanic neighbors, the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes was a strong sign. He made it visible that Rome did not only appear occasionally with troops, but was permanently present. Towers, forts, streets, and palisades showed organization, resources, and staying power. But this visible power could have various effects. It could deter but also attract. Roman goods were in demand, Roman money carried weight, Roman titles could lend prestige. Some Germanic leaders were able to benefit from relations with Rome, others saw it as a threat to their independence. Thus, the limes became a place of political tension, where Rome had to constantly observe which groups were friendly, insecure, or hostile. The Roman population in the provinces probably also perceived the limes as a promise of protection. Anyone who lived on an estate in the hinterland, who grew wine, stored grain, or transported goods by road, was dependent on security. The limes gave the impression that the emperor's power was also effective near the border. This psychological function should not be underestimated. Domination does not only live from the fact that violence can be exercised. It also thrives on the fact that people believe that they live protected and orderly. The limes was therefore also an instrument of trust. He showed the inhabitants of the provinces that Rome did not leave their world unguarded. At the same time, the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes was an enormous burden. It had to be manned, repaired, cared for, and managed. Every tower needed soldiers, every fort food, every horse fodder, every road care. The border devoured money, material, and human power. As long as the empire was economically and politically stable, this burden could be borne. But it remained a permanent commitment. The limes was not a one-off construction effort, but a constantly running system. Its value depended on Rome being willing and able to preserve it year after year. Its importance becomes particularly clear in the 3rd century AD, when the empire came under increasing pressure. Internal power struggles, frequent changes of emperor, economic burdens, and external attacks weakened Rome's ability to secure the borders as before. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes became increasingly endangered during this time. Germanic groups crossed the border, Roman troops were transferred or weakened, and the old order began to crumble. Finally, Rome withdrew from many areas behind the limes and oriented itself more towards the Rhine and Danube. This did not mean the end of Roman power in the west, but it showed that the advanced land border could no longer be held permanently. It is precisely this later retreat that makes clear what the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes had previously achieved. For a long time, he had stabilized a Rome that would have been harder to control without him. He had combined the military, administration, business, and everyday life. He had given depth to the Roman provinces and made the border visible. He had made encounters possible and at the same time supervised. It was an achievement of Roman organization, but also a sensitive system that remained dependent on the strength of the empire. Today, the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes is an important archaeological monument. Its remains are not only reminiscent of Roman architecture, but of an entire border world. They contain the story of soldiers on watchtowers, of merchants on dusty roads, of Germanic groups beyond the Palisade, of officials, commanders, craftsmen, families, and emperors who made decisions from a great distance. This border was never just wood, stone, and earth. It was a stage on which the fundamental questions of Roman rule were revealed. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes therefore exemplifies the essence of the entire limes. It was strong because Rome could plan, build, and operate it. He was vulnerable because he constantly needed people, resources, and political stability. It separated, but it also united. He protected, but at the same time he showed that Rome had to limit itself. Anyone who looks along this border sees not only the end of an empire, but also its ability to bring order to an uncertain world. And at the same time, one realizes that any border, no matter how powerful it may seem, only exists as long as the power behind it remains strong enough. Chapter 6: Watchtowers, Palisades, and Walls. If you want to understand the limes, you have to see its buildings not only as military installations, but as a language of power. Every watchtower, every palisade, every ditch, every wall said something. They told the people within the empire that Rome was vigilant. They told the people on the other side of the border that an orderly, controlled, and guarded space began here. And they told the soldiers themselves that their service was part of a larger system that extended far beyond the individual post. The limes was not built in the same way in all places, but everywhere it followed the same basic idea: see, report, steer, control, and gain time in an emergency. The most striking elements of the limes were the watchtowers. They often stood on hills, on the edges of terrain, along straight border sections or in places from which paths, valleys, and open spaces could be easily overlooked. A watchtower was not a mighty fort or fortress that was supposed to withstand a major attack for a long time. His most important task was observation. The men who were on duty there looked across the border, paying attention to movements in advance, to smoke, to riders, to groups of traders, to cattle drives, or to suspicious gatherings. In a border area where danger did not always appear as a huge army, but often as a small mobile group, attention was crucial. Many of these towers were initially made of wood. Wood was available more quickly, easier to process, and allowed the borderline to be expanded quickly. Later, stone towers were erected in some sections, which were more durable and made the Roman presence even more visible. A tower usually had several floors. Supplies, tools, or equipment could be at the bottom. The guards' lounge area was above them, and the platform from which they observed was located at the top. From there you could often see the next tower in clear weather. This line of sight was of central importance. The limes did not function through individual isolated points, but through a net. If a tower noticed something, it had to be possible to pass on the message. Signal transmission was therefore a heart of the system. You can imagine a soldier standing on a platform, looking out over the landscape, and suddenly discovering an unusual movement. Maybe a larger group is approaching from the forest. Perhaps smoke rises in a place where there is no known camp. Perhaps a trader reports unrest across the border. At such a moment, the information was not allowed to get stuck on the tower. She had to go to the next post, to the next castle, to the commander. Fire signals, smoke signals, horn signals, or messengers could be used. Which form was chosen in each individual case depended on distance, time of day, weather, and urgency. Crucially, Rome tried to keep a watchful eye out of the border. But a watchtower alone could not stop anyone. For this reason, many sections were additionally provided with palisades. A palisade consisted of strong wooden piles that were placed close together in the ground. It was not always intended to permanently repel a determined large-scale attack. Their task was more subtle and practical. It made uncontrolled movements more difficult. It prevented small groups from crossing the line somewhere unnoticed. It forced people to use certain passages. And it made the border visible. In a landscape of forest, hills, and fields, a palisade said very clearly, "Here runs a line of order." This visibility was politically important. Modern people often think of maps, passports, and barriers when they think of borders. In antiquity, however, rule was strongly tied to visible signs. Anyone who could see a border understood it more directly. The palisade transformed an abstract claim to power into a physical experience. You had to stop in front of it, walk around it, look for a transition, or consciously cross it. It was precisely because of this that the power of Rome became felt every day. For a retailer, it could mean that he had to register his goods at a controlled point. For a Germanic visitor, she was able to show that contact with Rome had rules. For a Roman farmer in the hinterland, she was able to convey security. In addition to the palisade, ditches and ramparts played a major role. A ditch made it difficult to cross the border quickly. A wall increased visibility and could provide additional cover. Such installations were easier to build compared to a solid stone wall, but they still required enormous manpower. Earth had to be excavated, heaped up, and shaped. The course had to be measured. The system had to be adapted to hills, streams, forests, and paths. The combination of the elements was particularly important. A ditch alone was useful, a wall alone as well. Together with a palisade, watchtowers, and castles, they formed a system in which each part complemented the other. In Rhaetia, a stone wall was later built in some sections. This wall differs significantly in effect from a wooden palisade. Stone seems more durable, heavier, more unyielding. A wall was not only a practical barrier, but also a strong symbol. It gave the impression of permanence. Anyone who stood in front of a Roman stone wall saw not only an obstacle, but the built self-assurance of an empire that set its order in the landscape. But even a wall was not invincible. It could be overcome, damaged, or bypassed. Its strength lay less in stopping every conceivable attack on its own, but in facilitating control, observation, and military response. The differences between the palisade, rampart, and wall show that the limes was not a uniform structure. Rome did not build the same everywhere, because the border did not have to do the same everywhere. In some regions, a visible marking with watchtowers was sufficient. In others, stronger obstacles were needed. Sometimes the terrain itself was part of the defense. A steep slope, a dense forest, a river course, or a swamp could form a natural barrier that was supplemented by artificial structures. Roman engineering did not mean ignoring nature, but making it militarily usable. The limes should not be imagined as a completely complete barrier. There were paths, gates, transitions, and controlled points. A border that would have made any exchange impossible would have been impractical for Rome itself. Trade, diplomacy, news, and regular contacts were important. The Romans did not simply want to prevent all movements, but to make them visible and controllable. This was precisely the actual function of many systems. The limes was less a closed wall than a filter. It should distinguish between permitted and unauthorized movement, between trade and danger, between known persons and unknown groups. For the soldiers, these buildings meant an everyday life of vigilance and work. Service at a tower could be lonely and monotonous. You were exposed to wind, rain, cold, and heat. You might not see anything special for days and still had to stay alert. It was precisely this mixture of boredom and possible danger that was typical of border service. A soldier didn't just have to be able to fight. He had to observe, report, maintain, repair, carry wood, control paths, and carry out orders. The limes was not only a place of heroic battles, but above all a place of constant routine. Maintenance was also a constant topic. Wood rotted, piles loosened, roofs leaked, towers had to be repaired. Rain could damage ditches, plants overgrew open lines of sight, paths became muddy, storms could destroy buildings. A border does not live from its construction alone. It has to be cared for. This made the limes a permanent burden for the Roman military. Each section demanded attention. The longer the line became, the greater the effort. Behind the apparent calm of a border system, there was therefore enormous logistics. The buildings of the limes also had a psychological effect on both sides. For the inhabitants of the Roman provinces, they were able to convey the feeling of being part of a protected world. They knew that soldiers were standing guard somewhere in front of their own fields, roads, and settlements. For the people on the other side of the border, the same sight could have different effects. Some may have perceived the investments as intimidation, others as an invitation to trade in designated locations, and still others as a challenge. A border that is supposed to show power always generates reactions. It calms some and irritates others. It is particularly interesting that the limes remained a very human system despite its visible hardness. A tower was only as vigilant as its crew. A palisade was only as effective as controlling its passages. A wall was only as strong as the troops behind it. Rome could put wood, stone, and earth in the landscape, but these things needed people to use them. This was the real strength and at the same time the weakness of the limes. It was not a magic line that automatically generated security. It was a system of material, discipline, experience, and organization. The Roman preference for clear structures was particularly evident at these border fortifications. Where there was uncertainty, Rome set order. Where the landscape was confusing, Rome erected towers. Where movements were difficult to control, Rome built palisades and crossings. Where distances were great, Rome created signal routes and roads. The limes was thus an attempt to make uncertainty measurable and controllable. He transformed an open border landscape into a space that could be observed, divided, and managed. But it was precisely this order that had its limits. When major attacks came, when internal crises tied up troops, When supplies failed to materialize or when political stability was lacking, towers and walls alone could do little. The limes was dependent on the functioning of the entire empire. A palisade without soldiers was just wood. A tower without a news network was only a vantage point. A wall without supplies was just stone. The buildings seemed powerful, but their power came from the system that supported them. Watchtowers, palisades, and walls were much more than technical components of a border. They were signs of Roman thought. They showed the desire to order spaces, control risks, and make power visible. They made the limes an experiential reality, a line that could be seen, touched, and crossed. For the Romans, they meant protection and control. For the Germanic neighbors, they meant proximity and distance at the same time. For history, however, they are a symbol of how an empire tried to bring its outer edges into solid shapes. In the end, these buildings tell of the special mixture of strength and vulnerability that characterized the limes. They show a power that possessed enormous organizational skills, which could survey landscapes, clear forests, erect towers, and build walls. But they also show a power that knew it had to observe because danger was possible. The limes was therefore not only a bulwark, but also a sign of constant attention. Its towers, palisades, and walls showed that Rome did not simply have its border. It had to assert it anew every day. Chapter 7. The Forts as Military Centers. The forts were the backbone of the limes. Without them, watchtowers, palisades, moats, and walls would have been only outward signs, but no real power. It was only the forts that gave the border strength, depth, and ability to act. They were used to send out patrols, supply watchtowers, monitor roads, control passages, and set troops in motion in an emergency. Anyone who sees the limes only as a line, therefore, overlooks the decisive factor. The real strength of the Roman border lay not only in the visible barrier, but in a dense network of military bases that organized the border area and kept it alive. A Roman fort was more than a camp for soldiers. It was a precisely planned space in which order, discipline, and practicality came together. The Romans built their military camps according to clear principles. Even if the size, material, and location were different, the internal structure usually followed a recognizable pattern. There were gates, road axes, administrative buildings, accommodation, workshops, warehouses, stables, and a central area for orders and administration. This order was no coincidence. It reflected the Roman idea that military strength comes from structure. A soldier should know where he sleeps, where his unit is, where weapons are stored, where orders are issued, and which gate he uses to move out in the event of an alarm. The fort was therefore a small image of Roman organization. Even from the outside, it made an impression. A moat, a rampart, a wooden or stone wall, and several gates created a clear separation between the military interior and the surrounding area. Anyone who entered a fort entered a world of rules. Here, duty rosters, orders, rankings, and military procedures determined everyday life. The gates were not only entrances, but checkpoints. The camp streets led through the interior in an orderly manner. The staff building was located in the center, because that's where the commander's authority was concentrated. Everything about a fort was supposed to show that Rome did not improvise, but planned. In the forts on the limes, auxiliary troops were often stationed, the so-called auxiliary troops. They differed from the legions, but were indispensable for border security. Many of these soldiers came from different parts of the empire. Some came from Gaul, Hispania, Thrace, Syria, North Africa, or other provinces. It is precisely this diversity that shows how the Roman military functioned. People from many regions served under Roman command on a border that was often far away from their homeland. For them, the fort was not only a military workplace, but the center of their lives for years. The tasks of these soldiers were diverse. They were not constantly engaged in major battles, but mainly performed border duty. They guarded roads, accompanied transports, controlled crossings, carried out patrols, kept in touch with watchtowers, and observed movements beyond the limes. Cavalry units were able to move out quickly when reports arrived. Infantry units secured sections, reinforced posts, or were used for construction and repair work. Everyday life was characterized by routine, physical work, and constant readiness. It was precisely this mixture that made the service demanding. It was not the one great battle that determined the lives of many soldiers, but the constant duty to keep a border functional. A fort also had to be supplied. That sounds obvious, but it was a huge task. Soldiers needed grain, meat, salt, oil, wine, water, clothing, shoes, weapons, tools, firewood, and medical care. Horses and draft animals need feed, stables, and care. Weapons had to be repaired, roofs replaced, supplies protected, and roads maintained. Each garrison was therefore part of a larger supply system. Merchants, local producers, state magazines, and military transports ensured that the castle did not remain isolated. A border could only be strong if its soldiers were fed and equipped. Discipline played a central role within the fort. The Roman army was famous for its order, but this order had to be established every day. There were watch times, exercises, inspections, cleaning work, construction tasks, and on-call services. Weapons and equipment had to be in good condition. Orders had to be understood and carried out. Anyone who violated the rules could be punished. This strictness was necessary from the Roman point of view, because a border force was not allowed to become negligent. Especially in a place where nothing happened for a long time, there was a risk of inattention. The enemy, the danger, or the crisis rarely announced themselves comfortably. That's why discipline was also a weapon against the fatigue of everyday life. The staff building, often laid out as the center of the fort, was the place of military administration. This is where orders were collected, reports were written, duty rosters were organized, and important documents were stored. The commander not only had to be able to fight, but also administer. He needed to know how many men were ready for action, what supplies were available, what repairs were needed, and what reports were coming in from the towers. A fort on the limes was thus an information hub. News from the surrounding area converged here and were evaluated. From here, decisions were made that could affect the entire section. Religious and symbolic elements were also important in the castle. The Roman army was not only a practical organization, but also a community with rituals. Standards, imperial images, sacrificial acts, and festivals strengthened the connection between soldiers, unity, and empire. The emperor was far away from many soldiers, but his image and name were present in everyday military life. Loyalty to Rome and the emperor was secured not only by pay and command, but also by rituals, concepts of honor, and common identity. Those who served in the fort were part of an order that saw itself as the bearer of power and civilization. But the forts were not closed worlds. Directly in front of or next to many camps, civilian settlements, the so-called fort villages, were built. These places were closely linked to the military. Traders, craftsmen, innkeepers, family members, women, children, former soldiers, and people seeking work or protection lived there. Although the military order in the castle was strict, life around the castle was lively and diverse. Soldiers bought goods, had shoes repaired, visited taverns, established relationships, and had contacts with the local population. Thus, a social world emerged around the military centers, which made the limes more human and complex. The proximity between the military and the civilian population was useful for Rome, but not without risks. On the one hand, the fort villages provided supplies, trade, and stability. On the other hand, conflicts could arise. Soldiers had power, money, and weapons. Civilians were dependent on them, but could also pursue their own interests. Traders wanted to make a profit, locals had to live with the Roman presence, and people on the other side of the border could get information through contacts. The border was never completely sealed off. The forts were centers of control, but precisely for this reason also places of exchange. Architecturally, the forts reflected adaptability. Some were initially built of wood and earth, later built in stone. This depended on the durability of the site, the available resources, and the military situation. A wooden earth fort could be created quickly and changed if necessary. A stone fort meant longer duration and greater visibility. When Rome used stone, it often showed that a location was important in the long term. The expansion of a fort could therefore also be a political message: Rome is here to stay. The location of a fort was carefully chosen. It was to be easily accessible, connected to other military sites by road if possible, close enough to the border to be able to react, but also located in such a way that supplies remained possible. Water was important, as was terrain overview and defensive capability. Some castles stood at crossings, road crossings, or near important valleys. Others secured particularly endangered sections. The Romans understood that military power consisted not only of the number of soldiers, but also of the right placement. A well-located fort could control an entire room. In an emergency, the forts were the starting points for military reaction. If a watchtower sounded the alarm, the report had to be sent quickly to the responsible base. There, the commander could decide whether a patrol was sufficient, whether cavalry had to be sent out, or whether larger reinforcements were needed. The border should buy time. An attack should not surprisingly reach deep into the rear. Even if an enemy overcame the palisade or passed through a section, it should be possible to observe and track. The forts turned the borderline into an active defensive system. At the same time, forts were places of power projection. They showed the environment that Rome was not just a distant idea, but concretely present. Walls, gates, soldiers, standards, weapons, and roads made the rule visible. For people within the provinces, this could have a calming effect. For people beyond the limes, it could be intimidating. For local elites, it could mean an invitation to cooperate. A fort was therefore also a political place. Negotiations could take place there, gifts could be handed over, complaints could be made, or alliances could be cultivated. Military power and diplomacy were often closer together than it seems at first glance. The life of the soldiers in these forts was marked by tension. On the one hand, the service offered security, pay, care, and perhaps the prospect of social advancement. Especially for auxiliary soldiers, Roman citizenship could beckon after a long period of service, which meant an enormous improvement in status. On the other hand, life was hard. The period of service was long, home was often far away, the climate unusual, the work physically demanding. Illnesses, accidents, violence, and loneliness were part of reality. The Limes was not a romantic outpost, but a place where people spent years of their lives in the service of an empire. The forts make it clear how much the Limes depended on organization. A tower could observe, a palisade could mark, a wall could impress. But the castle was the place where decisions, people, supplies, and orders came together. It was the heart of the border section. Without forts, the Limes would have had no depth. With them, it became a functioning military space. In the end, the forts were therefore more than military functional buildings. They were hubs of a border society. They combined discipline and everyday life, power and administration, war preparation and civilian life. They showed that Rome not only built its borders, but inhabited them. At the forts, the Roman order became tangible, but also its dependence on people, supplies, and political stability. As long as these centers functioned, the Limes could work. When they were weakened, the border lost its heart. A look at the forts therefore shows particularly clearly that the Limes did not simply consist of wood, stone, and earth, but of a whole system of human work, military discipline, and imperial organization. Chapter 8: Soldiers on the Edge of the Empire. The soldiers on the Limes stood in a special place in the Roman world. They did not live in the center of the empire, not in Rome, not in the big cities of the Mediterranean, but on a border where security and insecurity met every day. Behind them lay provinces, streets, estates, markets, and castles. In front of them began a space that Rome observed, influenced, and feared, but never completely dominated. For these men, the Limes was not a distant symbol of Roman power, but the place of their service, their labors, their hopes and their privations. It was they who turned towers, palisades, walls and forts into a living border system. Not only legionnaires served on the limes, as is often imagined. The actual security of many sections of the border was mainly in the hands of the auxiliary troops, the so-called auxilia. These units consisted of soldiers, often from the provinces or from areas under Roman influence. They could come from Gaul, Hispania, Thrace, Syria, North Africa, or other parts of the empire. Some were infantrymen, others horsemen, archers or specialists. It was precisely this diversity that was a strength of the Roman army. Rome knew how to put people from different regions at its service and use their skills to secure the empire. For many men, entering military service was a hard, but also tempting decision. The service was long, arduous, and dangerous, but it provided regular pay, provision, social prestige, and the prospect of advancement. For members of the auxiliary troops, Roman citizenship could be granted at the end of their service. That was a huge incentive. Citizenship meant not only a legal title, but access to a higher social status, better rights, and new opportunities for one's own family. A man who joined the army as a provincial citizen could be discharged after decades as a Roman citizen. Thus, military service became a way by which Rome bound people to itself. However, the everyday life of these soldiers was far from glory and heroic battles. Most of the time, the service consisted of routine. Guards had to be assigned, patrols had to be run, gates had to be checked, messages had to be delivered, supplies had to be checked, and facilities had to be maintained. A soldier on the limes not only had to be able to fight. He had to dig, build, repair, march, carry, observe, and obey. The Roman army was not only a war machine, but also a work organization. Their soldiers built roads, dug trenches, erected towers, fortified camps, and kept paths passable. The border was not finished once it was built. It had to be constantly renewed, and this work was largely done by the soldiers themselves. The training was rigorous. A Roman soldier should be physically resilient, obedient, and reliable. Marching was one of the basics. The ability to travel long distances with equipment was crucial to any military operation. In addition, there were weapon exercises, formation drill, guard discipline, and the handling of tools. In addition, cavalry soldiers had to control their horses, care for them, and keep them ready for use in the field. Those who served on the limes had to be prepared for different situations. A small incident at a border crossing required different behavior than a nighttime alarm or a major incursion. The strength of Roman soldiers therefore lay not only in courage, but also in practice, obedience, and the ability to act in an orderly manner under pressure. The equipment shaped everyday life as well as combat. Weapons, helmet, shield, armor, belt, shoes, and coat were not only objects, but part of the soldier's identity. Good shoes were particularly important, because service on the limes meant constant walking, standing, and marching. Bad paths, rain, mud, snow, and stony ground could become a burden. Clothing and weather protection were also decisive, as many soldiers came from regions with a different climate. Those who came from the Mediterranean region or from warmer provinces had to get used to the damp forests, cold winters, and changeable seasons on the Rhine, Danube, and southern Germany. Life in the castle followed fixed procedures. The day started early. Guards were relieved, animals were cared for, orders were issued, work was distributed. Some soldiers went on patrol, others stayed in the camp, and still others were assigned to construction work, repairs, or transport services. In the shelters, the men lived close together. Privacy was low. Comradeship was therefore important, but conflicts were also inevitable. People from different regions, with different languages, habits, and temperaments had to live together under a command system. The Roman army formed a military community out of this diversity. Discipline and common rituals helped to create cohesion. The service at the border demanded attention. Danger was not always open. Sometimes it was traces in the terrain, unusual movements, rumors of merchants, or reports from neighboring towers. A good border soldier had to learn to read the landscape. He needed to know which paths were frequently used, which groups acted regularly, where people could gather, and which signs were suspicious. The limes was therefore not only a place of strength, but also a place of knowledge. Those who served there collected information about people across the border, about trade movements, about weather, paths, moods, and possible threats. Not every service was equally dangerous, but uncertainty always remained. Small robberies, smuggling, disputes, cattle theft, or unauthorized border crossings could occur at any time. A major attack was rarer, but for that very reason it could not be ruled out. The soldiers lived in a world in which long periods of peace could suddenly be interrupted by alarms. This tension between boredom and danger is typical of border duty. Days could pass uniformly, and then a single moment decided whether a unit reacted correctly. In addition to the military task, soldiers also had a social role. They were representatives of Rome. For the people in the fort villages, for traders, farmers, and travelers, they were the visible power of the empire. A soldier could mean protection, but also control. He could check goods, secure paths, enforce orders, or influence disputes. In doing so, he stood between the state and the population. His behavior could create trust or provoke rejection. Rome knew that border guards not only had to fight, but also embody authority. Many soldiers had close contacts with the civilian environment. Even though military rules determined official life, relationships, family ties, and economic ties developed. Women, children, merchants, and former soldiers lived in the settlements near the forts. Goods were sold there, food was cooked, tools were made, clothes were repaired, and messages were exchanged. A soldier who served in the same place for years did not remain completely separate from this world. He shopped, knew people, made friends, formed bonds, and became part of a border society. The limes was therefore not only a military line, but also a human habitat. Nevertheless, the soldier remained primarily subject to the order. He could be transferred, had to obey, and lived under the pressure of military punishments. Desertion, disobedience, or negligence could be punished severely. The Roman army functioned because it subordinated individual wishes to order. This was especially important at the border. If a tower post fell asleep, if a patrol neglected its route, or if a commander ignored warnings, an entire section could be endangered. Discipline was not just military toughness, but a prerequisite for security. The origin of the soldiers also made the limes a place of cultural mix. Inscriptions, consecration stones, and archaeological finds show that men from different parts of the empire brought their own gods, customs, and memories with them. In addition to Roman deities, local or Eastern deities were worshipped. Military units maintained their traditions. A soldier could sacrifice far from his homeland to a god who reminded him of his origins, while at the same time showing loyalty to the emperor. In this way, personal identity was combined with imperial order. In this respect, the limes was a mirror of the entire empire, different in people, uniform in system. For some soldiers, the border became their new home. After the end of their service, veterans often settled near their former location. They had contacts there, perhaps family, property, or economic opportunities. Veterans were valuable to Rome because they strengthened the Roman way of life, language, discipline, and loyalty in the provinces. They could act as farmers, traders, or local authorities. As a result, Roman influence continued not only through active troops, but also through former soldiers who remained in the border area. But service on the edge of the empire also had a dark side. Illness, injuries, poor care, homesickness, and death were part of reality. Not everyone reached the end of their service. Some died in fighting, others from accidents or disease. Life must also have been psychologically stressful. The distance from home, the strictness of the service, and the uncertainty of the border shaped the people. Behind the brilliant idea of Roman military power stood individual men with fears, hopes, and personal stories. It is precisely this human perspective that is important. The limes did not work because Rome was powerful in the abstract, but because concrete people served there. Men stood on watchtowers on cold nights. They repaired palisades in the rain, led horses through mud, carried heavy equipment on patrols, perhaps wrote letters far away, hoping for pay, recognition, or dismissal. They were tools of imperial power, but at the same time people with their own lives. In them, the great and the small of history were combined. The soldiers on the limes therefore show particularly clearly what Roman rule meant. It consisted not only of emperors, laws and monuments, but of daily work, of guard duty, sweat, obedience and organization. The edge of the empire was held not only by walls, but by people who were willing or forced to devote their lives to the service of this order. They made the border visible, guarded and capable of acting. In the end, these soldiers were more than defenders against external enemies. They were observers, workers, builders, policemen, representatives, mediators, and sometimes settlers. They stood in a place where Rome had to assert itself. As long as they served reliably, the limes could function. When their numbers dropped, their supplies faltered, or their loyalty was shaken by crises, the border lost its power. The limes was therefore always the result of human discipline. Its towers and walls could last a long time, but its real strength lay in the men who watched, worked, and ensured day after day that Rome remained present at the edge of its world. Chapter 9: Everyday Life in the Shadow of the Border. The limes was not only a place of soldiers, watchtowers, and orders. It was also a habitat. Where Rome fortified its border, there arose not simply a lonely military line on the edge of the known world, but an entire society in the shadow of the castles. People worked, traded, cooked, prayed, argued, celebrated, loved, and died there. Anyone who imagines the limes only as a series of palisades and towers overlooks this human side. For it is precisely in everyday life that it becomes apparent how deeply Roman rule intervened in the landscape. A border not only had to be guarded, it had to be cared for, inhabited, and economically supported. Civilian settlements arose around many forts, which can be described as fort villages. They were usually located outside the military installations, often directly in front of the gates or along the roads leading to the camp. These places were closely linked to the military, but they were not purely soldiers' camps. Merchants, innkeepers, blacksmiths, potters, carpenters, carters, farmers, women, children, former soldiers, and people from different parts of the empire lived there. Some came voluntarily because they saw economic opportunities on the edge of the border. Others followed relatives or sought protection near Roman troops. Still others were bound to these places by trade, service, or dependence. The fort was the engine of these settlements. A garrison constantly needed food, clothing, tools, animals, firewood, leather, ceramics, metal goods, and services. Soldiers received pay, and this pay flowed into the surrounding area. They bought bread, meat, wine, beer, oil, clothing, shoes, or small personal items. They visited taverns, had equipment repaired, or used the services of craftsmen. This is how military presence became economic life. Where Rome stationed soldiers, markets sprang up. Where markets emerged, people came. And where people lived, a new social world grew. Everyday life in a fort village was probably loud, busy, and varied. One can imagine narrow paths along which merchants spread out their wares, craftsmen worked in front of their workshops, and animals were driven through the dust or mud. From forges sounded the hammering on metal. Vessels were made or sold in potteries. Soldiers, merchants, and travelers sat together in simple inns. Carts brought grain, wood, or barrels. Children ran around between houses and workshops. Languages, dialects, and accents mixed. Latin was the language of the administration and the military, but in everyday life you probably heard many other languages and local dialects. The border attracted people of different origins, and Roman soldiers often came from distant provinces. Traders could come from Gallic cities, from the Alpine region, or from neighboring regions. Indigenous populations continued to live in the provinces and adapted to the Roman order in different ways. Some adopted Roman clothing, building forms, eating habits, or religious practices. Others preserved older traditions. This did not create a completely Roman world or an unchanged native world, but a mixed culture. Such mixtures are particularly evident at borders, because people with different experiences and interests meet there. Living in the fort villages differed greatly from the ideal image of large Roman cities. There were simple houses made of wood, clay, half timbering or stone, depending on the region, prosperity, and material. Some buildings served as residential buildings and workshops at the same time. Behind the houses there could be small farms where animals were kept, supplies were stored, or manual work was carried out. Life was practically organized. Luxury was not excluded, but it was unevenly distributed. Wealthier traders, veterans, or local elites could afford better equipment, while many people lived in modest circumstances. Nevertheless, the proximity to Rome brought things to these border areas that might not have existed in this density without the military. Coins, imported goods, writing culture, Roman ceramics, bathing facilities, and new forms of administration. The supply of food was particularly important. The soldiers and civilians on the limes had to be fed. Cereals, meat, vegetables, legumes, dairy products, salt, and beverages had to be available on a regular basis. Some of it came from the surrounding area. Another part was brought in via Roman supply routes. Estates in the hinterland played an important role in this. They produced for local markets and for the military. The limes therefore influenced not only the immediate borderline, but also the surrounding area. Farmers were able to benefit from demand, but also had to pay taxes or fulfill delivery obligations. The border was economically linked to many people who may never have stood on a watchtower themselves. Women also played an important role in everyday life on the limes, even if they are often less visible in the military sources. They lived in fortified villages, ran households, worked in trade, helped in workshops, ran inns, or had relationships with soldiers. For a long time, official marriage was legally restricted for ordinary soldiers, but relationships and families still existed. Children grew up near the camps, between military order and civilian life. For them, the limes was not an extraordinary place, but their home. They knew the gates of the castle, the sounds of the exercises, the markets, and the stories from across the border. Religion was another part of everyday life. In the border region, people worshipped Roman deities, local deities, patron gods of the military, and cults from other parts of the empire. Soldiers brought their religious ideas with them, merchants and locals their own. Altars, consecration stones, and small sanctuaries show that people expressed protection, healing, success, and gratitude religiously. For a soldier, a sacrifice before a patrol could be important, for a trader before a trip, for a family in case of illness or childbirth. Religion was not a separate sphere, but deeply integrated into everyday life. It gave people support in a world that was characterized by uncertainty. Bathing facilities were also part of life in many Roman settlements. Even on the border, Rome tried to maintain familiar forms of Roman culture. Bathing meant not only purification, but also conviviality, relaxation, and a piece of the Roman way of life. Where bathhouses existed, people met, talked about news, maintained contacts, and showed belonging to a certain culture. For soldiers, the bath was an important balance after duty, march, or work. For civilians, it could be a place of social life. Such facilities show that the limes knew not only toughness and military practicality, but also comfort, habit, and the desire for normality. But life in the shadow of the border was not free of fear. The proximity to the limes meant protection, but also danger. Those who lived there knew that beyond the palisade there were groups that could sometimes be trading partners, sometimes allies, sometimes opponents. Rumors of unrest could spread quickly. A robbery, a dispute at a crossing, or a military alarm message could suddenly change everyday life. For traders, the limit was both an opportunity and a risk. For farmers in the border region, it meant sales opportunities, but also the danger of plundering if military control weakened. So people lived in a mixture of trust in Rome and awareness of the fragility of this order. Conflicts were not only between Romans and groups on the other side of the border. Tensions could also arise within the border society. Soldiers had power and money. Civilians were often economically dependent on them. Retailers wanted to enforce prices. Customers did not want to be cheated. Different origins, languages, and legal statuses could create misunderstandings. Crime, disputes over property, debts, or personal conflicts are also part of everyday life. The Roman order promised justice and security, but it did not eliminate human conflicts. It only gave them a framework. Trade across the border made everyday life particularly lively. The limes was not an impenetrable partition wall. At certain points, goods, people, and information could pass through in a controlled manner. Roman products came to Germanic groups, while raw materials, animals, skins, or other goods from the precursor came to Roman markets. Such trade was not only economically but politically significant. Those who had access to Roman goods could gain prestige. Those who acted as mediators between the two sides were able to build influence. Everyday life on the limes was therefore part of larger power relations, even if it often seemed quite practical for those involved. Veterans also shaped life near the border. After a long period of service, some former soldiers settled in the region. They knew the country, had contacts, and perhaps had savings or rights that opened up new opportunities for them. As Roman citizens or experienced military men, they could play an important role in local communities. They brought Roman habits, language, and loyalty with them. At the same time, they became part of regional society. Thus, Roman influence continued not only through active garrisons, but also through people who stayed after military service. Everyday life on the limes shows how much border and life were interwoven. A border is never just a political line. It changes markets, families, paths, professions, fears, and hopes. On the limes, Roman power could be experienced every day, not only in orders and sentinels, but also in the price of grain, in the repair of a shoe, in a visit to a bathhouse, in an encounter with a merchant from the apron, or in a child's gaze on marching soldiers. Great history here consisted of many small plots. This is precisely why the limes is so fascinating. It was not only the end of the empire, but for many people the center of their lives. What was a strategic line for an emperor in Rome was a home, a job, a market, a risk, or an opportunity for others. The people in the shadow of the border lived with Rome, from Rome, and sometimes under the pressure of Rome. They benefited from security and trade, but had to deal with control, dependence, and danger. In the end, a look at everyday life makes it clear that the limes was not a dead military installation. It was a living frontier world. Its history was written not only by emperors, generals, and enemy attacks, but also by bakers, blacksmiths, innkeepers, traders, women, children, farmers, and veterans. They all made the limes more than a line of defense. They made it a space of human experience. Their lives showed what Roman rule really meant: order and burden, protection and control, opportunity and uncertainty. The shadow of the border was not only dark. It was full of voices, work, hope, and everyday life. Chapter 10: Trade, Contacts, and Cultural Exchanges. The limes was a border, but it was not an impenetrable wall. Anyone who understands it only as a barrier against Germanic groups sees only part of its reality. In truth, it was both a place of control and a place of encounter. People crossed this border, goods changed sides, messages were exchanged, gifts were given, alliances were formed, and mistrust was cultivated. The limes separated the Roman Empire from areas that were not under direct Roman rule, but it was precisely because the two sides lived so close to each other that lasting contacts were established. These contacts were not always peaceful, not always equal, and not always voluntary. But they profoundly shaped everyday life, the economy, and political relations at the border. For Rome, trade on the border was of great benefit. The Roman provinces needed raw materials, animals, labor, and information from the areas beyond the limes. Conversely, Roman goods were attractive to many Germanic groups. Ceramics, glass vessels, metal goods, jewelry, tools, weapon components, wine and coins crossed the border. Some of these things were used in everyday life, others had mainly symbolic meaning. A Germanic leader who owned Roman luxury goods could use it to show his rank. A beautiful vessel, a valuable piece of jewelry, or a Roman coin was more than just an object. It showed access to a powerful world. It could impress followers, honor guests, and strengthen political authority. Rome understood this effect very well. Gifts were an important tool in Roman foreign policy. A gift could express friendship, but it could also create dependency. Those who received Roman support were integrated into a network of expectations. A leader on the other side of the border could be strengthened by Roman gifts, but he also came under observation. Rome rewarded loyalty, fostered useful partners, and sought to pit rival groups against each other. Thus, the exchange of goods and gifts became a tool of power. What outwardly looked like trade or generosity was often part of political strategy. The Germanic tribes were by no means passive recipients of Roman culture. They chose what seemed useful to them. Roman goods were not simply used in Roman ways in Germanic communities, but were incorporated into their own social contexts. A Roman drinking vessel could take on a different meaning at a festival than in a city of the empire. A coin could be worn as jewelry, even if it was originally a means of payment. Metal could be melted down, reworked, or recombined. Cultural exchange, then, was not a simple process in which Rome gave and the others took over. It was a process of selection, adaptation, and reinterpretation. People also moved over the limes. Merchants came with goods, messengers delivered news, envoys negotiated, craftsmen sought work, prisoners were exchanged, refugees sought protection or opportunity. Some men from Germanic groups entered Roman service. They could serve as auxiliary soldiers, gain experience, receive pay, and achieve social advancement after a long period of service. Such men learned about Roman command structures, language, weapons, and ways of life. When they returned or maintained contacts in their areas of origin, they brought knowledge with them. As a result, Roman influences spread not only through goods, but also through experiences and personal stories. For Rome, such people were both valuable and risky. A man who knew both worlds could mediate, translate, and facilitate covenants. But he was also able to recognize Roman weaknesses and use this knowledge against Rome. The story of Arminius had shown how dangerous an opponent who had been trained in the Roman system could be. Therefore, dealing with people from the border region has always been characterized by ambivalence. Rome needed contacts, but contacts also created vulnerability. Those who allowed trade also let information flow. Those who promoted allies across the border could never be completely sure that their loyalty would last. Trade on the limes was therefore closely linked to control. Crossings, paths, and markets were not accidental. Rome wanted to direct movements. Traders should not cross the border anywhere, but in places that could be monitored. There, goods could be checked, taxes levied, people observed, and news collected. A border crossing was not only an economic place, but also a place of administration and education. Who came, what he brought with him, where he wanted to go, and with whom he spoke could be important for the Roman side. In this way, trade was combined with military knowledge. This exchange was particularly noticeable in the fort villages. Soldiers, traders, locals, and people from the apron met there. A market near a fort could bring together goods from different regions. Roman pottery lay next to local products, wine next to beer, metal tools next to skins or livestock. Such places were lively, loud, and multilingual. They negotiated prices, exchanged news, told about paths, dangers, moods, and political changes. In an era without modern means of communication, traders were important carriers of information. They often knew where there was unrest, which groups were on the move, and which leaders were gaining influence. This information was valuable for the Roman border administration. The limes functioned not only through towers and patrols, but also through knowledge. A commander wanted to know if a larger gathering was taking place across the border, if a rival leader had been overthrown, if a tribe had come under pressure, or if merchants were being threatened. Such developments could indicate coming conflicts. Trade and diplomacy were therefore part of an early warning system. Not every danger was discovered by a watchtower. Some dangers first appeared as rumors in a market. The cultural exchange was also reflected in lifestyle habits. In the Roman provinces near the limes, Roman and indigenous traditions mixed. People adopted Roman architectural forms, used Roman crockery, visited baths, or used coins. At the same time, local customs, names, religious ideas, and handicraft techniques have been preserved. This mixture was typical for many border regions. Rome did not always demand complete cultural uniformity. Loyalty, taxation, order, and the recognition of Roman authority were important. Within this framework, different traditions were able to live on. Religion offers a particularly good example of this. Soldiers brought deities from their regions of origin. Locals revered local protective powers. Roman state cults and the imperial cult were present. In border areas, these religious worlds could coexist or merge with each other. A person could sacrifice to a Roman god and at the same time respect a local deity. This may seem contradictory to us, but for many people of antiquity it was normal. Religion was strongly associated with protection, success, and community. Especially on an uncertain border, people sought divine assistance for travel, trade, health, and military service. On the Germanic side, too, contact with Rome changed social structures. Those who had access to Roman goods could gain power. This allowed differences within Germanic communities to increase. A leader who received Roman gifts or controlled trade was better able to reward his followers. At the same time, it was precisely this that could cause mistrust. Others could accuse him of being too dependent on Rome. Thus, the limes had a political effect beyond its own line. Roman influence did not end at palisades or walls. It continued through goods, prestige, alliances, and rivalries. But exchange did not mean harmony. Trade could turn into disputes at any time. An unpaid price, a confiscated property, an offended legation, or an assault at a crossing could trigger greater tensions. Smuggling, cattle theft, or unauthorized border crossings were also possible. The border was a space where trust and mistrust lived side by side. People could do business with each other and still see each other as possible enemies. It was precisely this tension that made the limes so dynamic. It was not simply a peaceful contact zone and not just a military front. He was both at the same time. For the Roman side, the balance was difficult. Too much isolationism would have destroyed economic and diplomatic opportunities. Too much openness would have jeopardized control. Therefore, Rome had to decide again and again how much exchange should be allowed, encouraged, or limited. These decisions could change depending on the political situation. In quiet times, trade was easier to do. In times of crisis, crossings were monitored more closely, contacts were restricted, or military measures were intensified. The limes thus reacted to moods and power relations. Its permeability was not a fixed state, but part of Roman border policy. In the long term, the contacts at the limes changed both sides. The Roman provinces were characterized by their proximity to the border. Their economy, their settlements, and their military organization were closely related to exchanges. The Germanic groups on the other side of the border were also influenced. Roman goods, military knowledge, coins, and political contacts changed the balance of power. But Rome also changed through these relationships. It had to learn to negotiate with people it did not fully control. It had to accept that the border did not mean absolute control, but constant negotiation. The limes thus shows an important truth about empires. Power is not just about building walls or deploying troops. Power also consists of ordering relationships. Rome wanted to determine who could pass, who could trade, who was considered a friend and who was a danger. But this order was never completely one-sided. The people on the other side of the limes acted according to their own interests. They took advantage of Roman offers, resisted Roman pressure, sought advantages or changed alliances. The border was a space of mutual observation. This is precisely why the cultural exchange on the limes was so important. He made it visible that Rome and the Germanic territories did not exist in complete separation. Both sides were intertwined, even if they distanced themselves from each other. The Roman world did not suddenly end at the Palisade, and the Germanic world did not begin in complete purity only behind it. In between was a border space in which people adopted, rejected, changed, and reinterpreted things. In the end, the limes was not only a line of separation, but also a bridge under control. It connected markets, people, and interests, while at the same time enforcing order and surveillance. This contradiction is where its historical significance lies. The limes guarded the edge of the empire, but it also opened windows into the world beyond. Through these windows came goods, news, ideas, hopes, and dangers. Rome wanted to determine what passed through, but it could never fully control the exchange. This is precisely where the living reality of this border is revealed. It was not silent and closed, but full of voices, goods, negotiations, and tensions. The limes was a place where two worlds met and both changed in the process. Chapter 11: Power, Control, and Propaganda. The limes was not only a military border. He was also a message. Anyone who walked along its towers, palisades, ditches, walls, and forts did not simply see wood, earth, and stone, but the built language of a world empire. Rome not only wanted to defend its borders, but to show that it could create order. The limes was intended to make it visible that the emperor's power did not end at the big cities, not in Rome, not in the provincial capitals, not on the military roads, but reached to the edge of the known Roman world. An important part of its significance lay in this visible order. The limes was a protective system, administrative space, and symbol of power at the same time. For the Romans, rule was always a question of representation. Power had to be seen, experienced, and believed. An emperor could not be personally present everywhere. Most people in the empire would never see him. Nevertheless, his authority had to remain felt everywhere. Coins bore his image, inscriptions mentioned his name, statues showed his dignity, officials acted on his behalf, and soldiers swore allegiance to him. The limes belonged to this world of signs. He made the emperor's claim visible in the landscape. Every watchtower, every castle, and every fortified line proclaimed that Rome was not just standing here by chance, but was ruling consciously. This effect was initially directed inwards. For the inhabitants of the Roman provinces, the limes was intended to convey security. Anyone who lived near the border had to be able to trust that Rome offered protection. Farmers tilled their fields, merchants transported goods, craftsmen worked in the fort villages, families lived in the shadow of the garrisons. All these people were part of an order that only worked if they believed in their stability. A visible border helped. It showed that the empire did not passively wait for dangers, but took precautions. The border was therefore also a promise. Rome watches, Rome protects, Rome orders. But a promise has to be renewed again and again. The limes was not just a backdrop, but a constant effort. Soldiers had to be stationed, towers occupied, paths maintained, gates controlled, and forts supplied. It was precisely this visible effort that could create trust. Anyone who saw that patrols were on the way, that guards held their posts, and that orders were being carried out could experience Roman power as real. Domination was not just a law on a board, but a soldier at the gate, a commander in the castle, a controlled crossing, a road that led to the next base. To the outside world, the limes looked different, but no less clear. For the people on the other side of the border, it was a sign that Rome was permanently present. The empire not only occasionally came with a punitive expedition, then withdrew and disappeared again. It built, occupied, observed and organized. That could be a deterrent. Anyone who wanted to cross the limes had to expect to be seen. Anyone planning a robbery had to know that reports could be passed on. Those who negotiated with Rome saw in front of them not only individual soldiers, but the material power of an empire that had enough resources to fortify an entire landscape. At the same time, this demonstration of power was not just a threat. It could also be attractive. For some people on the other side of the border, Roman order meant access to goods, wages, gifts, alliances, and prestige. A Germanic leader who was in contact with Rome was able to benefit from this. Roman estate strengthened his rank, Roman recognition could increase his position, Roman support could help him in the power struggle against rivals. The limes thus showed not only who was excluded, but also who could gain access to the Roman world under certain conditions. It was precisely because of this that he became a political tool. Control was the central goal. Rome did not want to prevent every movement, but to direct it. A completely closed border would have made trade, diplomacy, and information gathering more difficult. A completely open border would have endangered security. Therefore, Rome had to distinguish who was allowed to pass, which goods were allowed, which contacts seemed useful, and which groups were considered a threat. The limes was thus a filter. He created controlled transitions. He forced movements onto certain paths. He made encounters observable. From the Roman point of view, this was a step forward compared to a confusing open landscape. This control had many levels. Militarily, the aim was to detect enemy movements at an early stage. Economically, it was about trade, taxes, supply, and the control of the flow of goods. Politically, it was about alliances, legations, treaties, and influencing groups across the border. Socially, it was about the order of everyday border life, about the relationship between soldiers, civilians, traders, locals, and foreigners. The limes was therefore not only a defensive structure, but an instrument of administration. He helped Rome to make a difficult space legible. Roman propaganda used such border areas to tell of strength. Emperors who secured borders could present themselves as protectors of the empire. A successful border expansion, a military inspection, or the restoration of facilities could be politically valuable. The message was, the emperor ensures peace, security, and order. This idea was important because Roman rule always lived on recognition. An emperor not only had to rule, he had to show that he could rule. Borders offered an ideal stage for this, because there the power of the empire seemed to prove itself directly against insecurity and external danger. The depiction was often clearer than reality. In the official language, the limes could appear as a fixed line of order. In reality, it was permeable, dependent on people, money, supplies, weather, political relations, and military attention. Propaganda always simplifies. It shows power as closed, calm, and superior. But at the border, power was never completely calm. It had to be made anew every day. This is precisely what makes the limes so interesting. On the one hand, it was a strong symbol of Roman self-assurance, and on the other hand, it was a place of constant uncertainty. Rome was well aware of this uncertainty. Control did not mean knowing everything or preventing everything. Control meant reducing risk, observing movements, and enabling responses. The border should buy time. If an attack was imminent, watchtowers had to report, forts had to react, and larger troops had to be alerted. If trade took place, it should take place in known places if possible. When envoys came, they were to be registered and politically classified. The limes was thus an answer to the question of how an empire can deal with what lies outside its direct control. The power of the limes also lay in its regularity. Towers in sight, road connections, forts at certain intervals, recurring forms of construction and military processes created a sense of system. That was typically Roman. Rome loved order not only as a practical means, but as an expression of its identity. From the Roman point of view, an orderly border differed from a disorderly outside world. However, this juxtaposition was also ideological. It helped Rome to see itself as a bearer of civilization and to portray the territories beyond the border as less orderly. In this way, the limes also became a line in thinking. This mental boundary was perhaps just as important as the structural one. On the one side was the empire with its law, cities, roads, taxes, administration, and imperial rule. On the other side were groups that Rome often described as restless, belligerent, or difficult to predict. Of course, this view was simplified and shaped by Roman prejudices. The Germanic territories were not simply chaotic, but had their own orders, their own power structures, and their own political logics. But Roman propaganda needed the contrast. The more the outside world appeared to be dangerous, the more important the Roman protecting power appeared. The limes therefore also served to define belonging. Those who lived within the border were part of the Roman order, or at least subject to its claims. Those who lived outside were beyond direct control. This did not mean that everyone within the border was equal. Roman society knew strong differences in legal status, origin, wealth, and rank. Nevertheless, the border created a common inside and outside. It helped to think of the realm as a space that was protected and ordered. For the soldiers themselves, this symbolism had a concrete meaning. They did not stand anywhere, but in a place that was understood as the edge of the Roman world. Their service was therefore associated with a special dignity, but also with special pressure. They embodied Rome's power over its neighbors and its own provincial population. A negligent soldier endangered not only a post, but the reputation of the order he represented. That's why discipline, rituals, and loyalty were so important. The border not only had to be kept practical, but also appear dignified. But propaganda could not permanently conceal weakness. When there were no soldiers, when forts were poorly supplied, when internal crises shook the empire, or when attacks increased, the built embassy lost its strength. A wall could still stand, while the power behind it was already becoming fragile. A tower could still be visible, but without a watchful crew it was just an empty body. The limes therefore shows very impressively that symbols are only as strong as the reality that carries them. Power can present itself, but it must also work. Especially in the 3rd century, this tension became more and more apparent. The Roman world came under pressure. Emperors changed rapidly, civil wars weakened the army, economic problems weighed on the provinces, and outside groups took advantage of the uncertainty. In such times, it became apparent that control was not a state, but an achievement. The limes had long provided stability, but this stability depended on the political and military power of the entire empire. If this power waned, the border could no longer fully fulfill its symbolic claim. Nevertheless, the limes remains one of the most impressive examples of Roman power politics. It shows how closely the military, administration, business, and representation were connected. Rome did not only build to protect itself. Rome built to be seen. It ordered landscapes in order to make rule tangible. It controlled transitions to combine security and influence. It used boundaries to show strength outwardly and care inwardly. In the end, the limes was therefore a great political text made of wood, stone, and earth. He told of an empire that wanted to carry its order to the edges. He told of emperors who promised protection, of soldiers who embodied this promise, of provincial residents who expected security, and of neighbors on the other side of the border who feared, used, and challenged Rome at the same time. But there was always a tension between aspiration and reality. The limes was a symbol of strength, but it was precisely as a symbol that it also betrayed the concern from which it had arisen. Because anyone who fortifies a border so visibly not only shows how powerful it is, he also shows that there is something he needs to protect himself from. Chapter 12. Crises at the border. The limes could only be strong as long as the empire behind it remained strong enough. In the times of its stability, it gave the impression of an orderly world. Watchtowers stood within sight of each other, forts supplied the border troops, roads connected the military bases, merchants passed through controlled crossings, and the people of the provinces could believe that Rome could carry its power to the very edge of the landscape. But this order was never a matter of course. It had to be paid, organized, defended, and politically supported. As soon as several stresses occurred at the same time, it became apparent how sensitive the whole system was. The crises on the border were therefore not only caused by attacks from outside, but also by weaknesses within the empire. There was already tension in the basic structure. The limes was long, complex, and dependent on constant attention. Every tower needed garrison, every fort supplies, every street maintenance, every unit pay, equipment, and clear orders. If there was a lack of supplies somewhere, if troops were moved, or if a commander did not have enough men, a section became weaker. A border is not endangered at its strongest point, but at its weakest. Enemy groups, smugglers, robbers, or smaller warrior formations did not have to overcome the entire limes. It was enough to find a loophole, take advantage of a poorly guarded crossing, or strike at a moment when Roman attention was tied up elsewhere. The external threats changed over time. On the other side of the limes there were no immovable, always the same opponents. Germanic groups formed alliances, dissolved them, came under pressure, sought booty, land, prestige, or political advantages. Some contacts with Rome were peaceful, others tense. As long as Rome appeared strong, cooperation was attractive to many leaders. Roman gifts, trade, and diplomatic recognition were able to strengthen their rank. But when Rome showed weakness, the bill changed. Then the border was perceived not only as a place of trade, but also as an opportunity. A successful raid could yield loot, reward followers, and increase a leader's fame. For many Germanic groups, war was not only a question of destruction, but also of prestige and internal power. A leader had to bind his followers. He needed success, gifts, booty, and visible strength. Rome was both dangerous and tempting. The Roman provinces offered supplies, metal, cattle, money, and valuable goods. If border security weakened, an attack could seem worthwhile. It was not always about big plans for conquest. Often it was raids, quick incursions, and targeted looting. For the affected people in the border area, this made little difference. A village, an estate, or a transport could be destroyed, even if there was no major campaign behind it. The Roman response to such threats depended on its own situation. In stable times, Rome was able to react quickly. Horsemen could move out of forts, patrols could follow tracks, larger units could reinforce endangered sections. Punitive expeditions across the border were intended to deter opponents and show that attacks were not without consequences. But such reactions require well-trained soldiers, reliable news channels, and political calm. When the empire was under pressure on several fronts at the same time, it became more difficult. Troops that were lacking on the limes were perhaps needed on the Danube, in the east, or in internal power struggles. Then a section of the border had to make do with fewer forces than would have been necessary. It became particularly dangerous when the internal situation of the empire worsened in the 3rd century. Frequent changes of emperor, usurpations, civil wars, economic burdens, and external attacks coincided. An emperor not only had to secure borders, but also assert his own rule. Rivals were able to seize troops, armies became involved in intra-Roman conflicts, and the loyalty of soldiers became a political factor. This was devastating for the limes. Soldiers who were supposed to occupy watchtowers or hold forts could be drawn into power struggles. Resources needed for border security flowed into other crisis areas. In such moments, it became clear how closely foreign policy and domestic policy were linked. A border rarely collapses only because of external enemies. It becomes vulnerable when the center becomes restless. The people of the limes may have lived far away from Rome, but they felt the consequences of imperial crises directly. When an emperor was murdered, when a new ruler promised payment of salaries, when troops were transferred, or when tax pressure increased, this had an impact even on the border forts. Big politics was inscribed in the small everyday life. A soldier on a tower, a farmer in the hinterland, or a merchant at a crossing could feel the consequences of decisions made far away. Economic burdens also weakened the border region. The limes was expensive. He devoured materials, labor, salaries, and supplies. In quiet times, the border could be supported by trade and regional production. But when uncertainty increased, it was precisely these foundations that suffered. Traders avoided dangerous routes. Farmers could leave fields or lose crops. Transport became riskier. Markets shrank. If fewer goods circulated, the supply of the forts became more difficult. When supplies deteriorated, the performance of the troops decreased. In this way, a crisis could reinforce itself. Uncertainty created economic weakness. Economic weakness created military problems. Military problems created even more insecurity. These crises were particularly hard for the civilian population in the border region. In times of stability, the proximity to the limes had offered advantages. Soldiers needed goods, markets sprang up, fort villages lived from the garrison, farmers found buyers. But this same closeness could become a danger in times of crisis. Those who lived close to the border were affected earlier when robberies increased. An estate could be plundered, a village burned down, a livestock stolen. People could flee, seek shelter in fortified places, or try to retreat deeper into Roman territory. The limes, which once promised security, now became a sign of an unsafe neighborhood. The psychological effect of such crises should not be underestimated. Rule is based on trust. People had to believe that Rome could protect. When this trust was shaken, the relationship between the population and the state changed. A single robbery was bad, but not yet a breakdown. However, repeated attacks, lack of help, and visible weakness could undermine faith in the Roman order. Those who no longer felt safe began to act differently. People hid supplies, left settlements, sought private protective relationships, or adapted to new power relations. A border does not only lose its meaning when all the forts have been destroyed. It already loses it when people are no longer convinced that it protects. At the same time, the situation remained complex. Even in times of crisis, there were not simply Romans on the one hand and enemies on the other. Some groups on the other side of the limes continued to trade with Rome. Some leaders sought Roman support. Some people crossed the border as refugees, mercenaries, traders, or messengers. Especially in turbulent times, contacts could even become more important. Rome needed information, allies, and mediators. But the border became more unpredictable. What was regulated exchange yesterday could turn into mistrust tomorrow. A market could be a place of trade and at the same time a place of espionage. An envoy could bring peace offers or just want to gain time. The Roman commanders on the limes, therefore, had to constantly weigh things up. Should they react harshly or negotiate? Should they close a passage or allow trading? Should they support an allied leader even though their loyalty was uncertain? Should they use their few men for patrols or rather concentrate in the castle? Such decisions were difficult because each option had risks. Too much harshness could create new enmity. Too much indulgence could signal weakness. Too much openness could be dangerous. Too much isolation could destroy important contacts. Border policy has always been a game of power, caution, and uncertainty. The buildings themselves also suffered from crises. If repairs were not made, palisades, towers, and paths fell into disrepair. Wood rotted, roofs became leaky, ditches silted up, lines of sight became overgrown. A section of the limes could still exist externally and yet lose its effectiveness internally. Archaeologically, one often only sees remains of stone, earth, or traces of wood, but behind every structural decay there was an organizational problem. Someone no longer had enough men, materials, or reasons to maintain the facility. In history, decay is rarely just nature. It is often a sign that an order is losing its priorities or its strength. The crises at the border also showed that the limes was not equally suitable against every kind of threat. It could be effective against small groups, smuggling, illicit movements, and limited raids, as long as it was manned and operated attentively. It was less suitable against larger coordinated attacks or against a general weakening of the empire. A border can warn, delay, and steer. But it cannot replace what is missing in the background: stable politics, a sufficient army, a functioning economy, and clear leadership. If these foundations became brittle, even a sophisticated border system could not withstand in the long term. This is precisely why the crises of the limes are a mirror of Roman history. They show that imperial power does not simply come from size. Size can also mean burden. An empire that has many borders has to solve many problems at the same time. It has to pay soldiers, secure roads, administer provinces, control rivals, and deter external opponents. As long as this interaction works, the realm seems unshakable. But if several parts fail at the same time, the size becomes a burden. The limes was one of the first systems on which such contamination became visible. At the end of the crises, there was not immediately a complete downfall. Rome did not disappear from Central Europe from one day to the next. But the old security of the advanced border system became increasingly questionable. The Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes lost its former stability in the 3rd century. Rome reoriented itself more strongly towards the Rhine and Danube, because these natural lines were easier to defend. That was a sober decision, but also a sign of a changed balance of power. The elaborately controlled land border, once a symbol of Roman organization, became too difficult to hold. The crises on the border, therefore, tell of more than military attacks. They tell of trust and fear, of political power struggles, economic stresses, local decisions, and human insecurity. They show how a border can slowly lose its strength before it is finally abandoned. The limes was strong as long as Rome filled it with people, money, discipline, and credibility. As these fundamentals weakened, the border was transformed from a symbol of security into a space of danger. This makes it understandable why the limes is particularly revealing in its crisis. In his heyday, he showed what Rome could achieve. In his weakness, he showed what this performance depended on. Towers, palisades, and castles seemed powerful, but their actual basis lay deeper. It lay in the ability of an empire to maintain order. When this ability was shaken, the boundary also began to falter. The limes did not fail because of a single blow, but because of an accumulation of loads. And this is precisely where its historical significance lies. It shows that even the most visible power becomes fragile when the invisible structure behind it cracks. Chapter 13: The Decline of the Limes. The decline of the limes was not a single moment, not a sudden disappearance of a border, not a dramatic day when Rome simply left its towers and left the Palisades to decay. It was a slow, multi-layered process in which military overload, political instability, economic burdens, and changing power relations interacted. This is precisely why this decline is so revealing. It shows not only how a border could fail, but also how a world empire began to rearrange its forces. The limes had long been a sign of Roman strength. His end made it clear that strength always depends on prerequisites: soldiers, supplies, political leadership, money, trust, and the ability to respond to threats. For many decades, the Upper Germanic Rhaetian limes had functioned because Rome was able to maintain it. Watchtowers were occupied, forts were supplied, roads were maintained, patrols were sent out, and crossings were controlled. The border was not insurmountable, but it was effective as long as the system behind it worked. But in the 3rd century AD, this system came under increasing pressure. The empire was huge, its borders long, its enemies numerous, and its internal order increasingly fragile. Dangers arose on several fronts at the same time. Troops were needed on the Danube, on the Rhine, in the east against the Sassanid Empire, and in the internal power struggles of the empire. No border existed on its own. If soldiers were withdrawn in one place, they were missing in another. If an emperor fought in the east, the west could become more vulnerable. When a usurper wanted to seize power, border troops were drawn into Roman civil wars. These internal power struggles were particularly destructive. In the 3rd century, the emperors changed frequently. Many rulers ruled only for a short time, Some were razed by their own soldiers, others were overthrown or murdered by rivals. For the military, this meant uncertainty, but also political significance. Armies became power factors, their loyalty had to be bought, and generals could even reach for the imperial dignity. This had direct consequences for the limes. Soldiers, who were supposed to secure the border, were needed for intra-Roman conflicts. Money that should have gone into repairs, supplies and border protection was used for salary payments, power struggles and emergency measures. The limes was not simply the victim of external attacks, but also the victim of an empire that used too much force on its own internal struggles. At the same time, the pressure from outside increased. Germanic groups on the other side of the border were not static. They changed, formed larger units, reacted to Roman weakness, and took advantage of opportunities. In particular, groups that later became more prominent under names such as Alemanni played an important role in southwestern Germany. These associations were not modern states, but mobile associations of warrior groups, leaders, followers, and communities. Their strength lay in their flexibility. They could strike quickly, loot, retreat, or form new alliances. For Rome, such opponents were difficult to grasp. A large Roman army could win a battle, but the permanent security of a long border remained difficult when new groups exerted pressure at different points. The limes was well suited against certain forms of threat. He was able to monitor small movements, control passages, make robberies more difficult, and warn at an early stage. But when several attacks took place simultaneously, when larger groups of warriors crossed the border or when the Roman garrisons were weakened, the system reached its limits. A watchtower could report, but it could not replace an army. A palisade could delay, but it did not stop a determined attack if there were too few soldiers behind it. A fort could resist, but if help was missing, it was isolated. The strength of the limes never lay in a single structure. It lay in the interplay. When this interplay was disturbed, the buildings also lost their effect. In addition, there was an economic exhaustion that was not always spectacular, but had a deep effect. Maintaining a border cost money in the long term. Soldiers had to be paid, animals fed, weapons replaced, walls repaired, roads maintained, and supplies delivered. In more peaceful times, the economies of the provinces could bear some of this burden. But crises also affected trade and agriculture. Raids endangered estates and transport routes. Uncertainty caused markets to shrink. People fled endangered areas or lost their livelihoods. If the economic area behind the limes weakened, this also weakened the border itself. A military line cannot be permanently stronger than the country that supplies it. The decline of Roman control was therefore often insidious. Perhaps some towers were no longer regularly occupied. Perhaps the repair of a palisade was delayed. Perhaps a fort was only partially used. Perhaps patrols failed to materialize because there were no horses or men had withdrawn. For the local people, such changes could seem inconspicuous at first, but they changed the feeling of security. A border does not only die when it is officially abandoned. It begins to die when its inhabitants realize that it no longer functions reliably. When merchants avoid dangerous paths, farmers abandon their farms, soldiers are less present, and rumors of new attacks make the rounds, then a border loses its authority. The loss of trust weighed particularly heavily. The limes had long conveyed to the people in the Roman provinces that the empire protected them. This protection was not only military, but also psychological. Those who lived under Roman rule paid taxes, accepted administration, and expected security in return. If Rome could no longer credibly offer this security, the relationship between the population and the state began to falter. People began to look for their own ways of hedging. They withdrew to fortified places, left endangered settlements, or came to terms with new power relations. Some regions were not abruptly depopulated, but their structure changed. Roman life, as it had developed under the protection of the border, became more uncertain. However, the decline of the limes did not mean that Rome was completely incapable of acting. The Reich reacted. It did not simply withdraw from all border areas, but changed its strategy. The reorientation to the Rhine and Danube was understandable from a military point of view. Rivers were easier to defend than a long land border with many towers, paths, and forts. They offered natural obstacles, facilitated transport, and could be controlled with fleets, bridgeheads, and fortified places. What looked like a loss was also an adjustment. Rome gave up an advanced space to secure a shorter and more durable line. This was not a sign of complete weakness, but a sober decision in a difficult situation. For the affected border regions, however, this decision was far-reaching. Territories that had long been within the Roman order now came more out of direct control. Forts were abandoned or lost their old function. Fort villages shrank, disappeared, or changed. Some people withdrew, others stayed and continued to live under changed conditions. Germanic groups were able to penetrate into areas that had previously been characterized by a Roman military presence. But here, too, one should not imagine a simple exchange in which one population disappears and another suddenly appears. Many things proceeded gradually, regionally differently, and with transitions. Archaeological traces show change, not always clear breaks. The term decline can easily create the impression that only decay is visible. But historically, the end of the limes was also part of a larger transformation. Roman power shifted, border politics changed, local societies adapted. What was a retreat for Rome could mean an opportunity for other groups. New settlement areas, new power relations, and new cultural mixtures emerged. The world at the former limes did not become empty. She became different. This is precisely where the tragedy and dynamics of this time lies. The end of an order did not mean the end of history, but the beginning of new developments. Nevertheless, the symbolic loss was enormous. The limes had made it visible that Rome could order the landscape. Its decay now showed that this order could no longer be taken for granted. For an empire that had seen itself for centuries as a bearer of stability and superiority, this was a sensitive experience. Borders are not just military lines. They are signs of political credibility. When such a boundary is abandoned, the question always arises as to whether it is a matter of wise adaptation or forced withdrawal. In the case of the limes, it was probably both. Rome adapted because it had to. So the causes were not a single mistake. Neither a single lost battle nor a single attack explains the end. The limes broke up due to an accumulation of loads. Political instability weakened the leadership. Civil wars tied up troops. Economic problems made supply and repair more difficult. Germanic groups took advantage of weaknesses and increased the pressure. The long land border became too expensive, too vulnerable, and too difficult to hold. Any of these causes alone might have been overcome. Together, however, they fundamentally changed the situation. This is precisely why the decline of the limes says so much about the limits of imperial power. An empire can build massive structures, raise armies, and organize landscapes. But it remains dependent on people, resources, and political stability. The limes was never just wood, stone, and earth. It was a promise that had to be fulfilled every day. When Rome could no longer reliably keep this promise, the border lost its meaning. Some of their buildings remained standing, but their political power dwindled. In the end, the decline of the limes was not a simple failure, but a historic turning point. It marked the transition from a phase of Roman forward defense to a more cautious strategy based more on natural boundaries. It showed that Rome was still capable of acting, but could no longer exercise the same control everywhere as before. For the people on the edge of the empire, it meant insecurity, adaptation, and often loss. For history, it means one of the clearest lessons of antiquity: borders do not exist because they were built. They exist as long as the power that has built them is strong enough to fill them with life. Chapter 14: What Remains of the Limes. When Roman control at the upper Germanic Rhaetian limes disappeared, the border did not simply disappear from the landscape. Towers did not all collapse at the same time, walls did not dissolve overnight, Castles were not abandoned everywhere at the same moment. What ended up was the function first. The limes ceased to be a living border of the Roman Empire. The watchtowers were no longer regularly manned. Palisades were no longer reliably renewed. Forts lost their military importance. Roads were maintained less frequently, and the old order of reports, patrols, supplies, and controls fell apart. But the traces remained. Wood rotted, stone was removed, ditches filled with earth, ramparts became flatter, but the landscape retained memories of a time when Rome had extended its power to this point. For the people who lived in these areas after Rome's retreat, the remains of the limes were not archaeological monuments at first. They were part of their immediate environment. An old wall could serve as a landmark. Stones from abandoned forts could be used for new buildings. Remains of walls, foundations, and hewn ashlars were valuable building material. Those who lived in a time when every usable piece of stone, metal, or wood had to be laboriously extracted did not see Roman ruins as historical testimonies, but as practical resources. Much of what Rome had built at great expense was later reused in churches, houses, walls, paths, or courtyards. The border did not disappear completely, but it changed its meaning. Military order became material for new life. In some areas, the traces remained more clearly visible than in others. A wall in the forest could exist for centuries because it was not plowed over. A ditch could be preserved as a depression in the terrain. The foundations of a fort could lie under fields and only become visible in certain light or after plowing. In other places, the remains almost completely disappeared because agriculture, settlements, stone theft, and natural erosion reshaped them. The landscape is not a silent archive that preserves everything unchanged. It is used, changed, built on, and forgotten. This is precisely why it is remarkable that the limes has left so many traces despite all the changes. In the Middle Ages, people often no longer knew exactly who had built these old facilities. While the memory of Rome was not completely lost, it was overlaid with legends, local narratives, and incomplete knowledge. Old walls and ramparts were sometimes associated with giants, pagans, legendary kings, or long-gone peoples. Names in the landscape could preserve memories without people understanding their origin exactly. What had once been Roman border policy became part of regional tradition. The border lived on, but in a transformed form, no longer as an instrument of imperial power, but as an enigmatic sign of a distant past. At the same time, the Roman heritage remained indirectly effective in many regions. Roads, settlement sites, and old traffic axes could continue to have an effect for a long time. Not every Roman road was still in use, not every fort became a later place, but the Roman character of the landscape did not disappear completely. Where people had once built paths, crossings, markets, or fortifications, later generations were able to build on them. History leaves behind not only visible walls, but also habits of space use. The limes had been abandoned as a border, but the spaces it had once ordered remained inhabited, farmed, and politically contested. In the early modern period, and especially in the period of growing historical research, the view of Roman traces began to change. Scholars, sovereigns, cartographers, and those interested in antiquity increasingly asked what these old ramparts, wall remains, inscriptions, and finds meant. Coins, stones, weapon remains, ceramics, and inscriptions were collected. At first, this was often done unsystematically, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of prestige, sometimes out of genuine scientific interest. But gradually a new understanding emerged. These remains were not accidental ruins, but testimonies of a great historical order. The limes became recognizable again as a Roman border. With the development of archaeology, this knowledge gained depth. Researchers began to map courses, examine fort sites, compare finds, and distinguish between construction phases. It was recognized that the limes was not built the same everywhere. Traces of wooden towers and stone towers, palisades, ditches, ramparts, walls, forts, bathing facilities, and fort villages were found. Each excavation added new details to the image. A mysterious line in the landscape slowly became a complex border system that combined military, economic, and social aspects. The limes was thus not only rediscovered, but also re-understood. This rediscovery also changed people's relationship to their own region. Places that were once perhaps only considered rural landscapes suddenly became part of a great European history. An inconspicuous hill could be a former watchtower site. A field could hide the remains of a fort. A forest path could run along an old Roman border. This brought antiquity closer. It was not only to be found in Rome, Pompeii, or Trier, but also in Hesse, Baden-Württemberg, and Bavaria, in villages, forests, and fields. The limes made it clear that world history does not only take place in capitals, but also in seemingly remote places. But with the rediscovery came responsibility. Many remains of the limes were endangered. Agriculture, road construction, settlement expansion, stone quarrying, and ignorance could destroy archaeological traces. What had survived in the ground for centuries could be lost in a short time. Therefore, an awareness of protection and preservation has increasingly developed. The limes was no longer regarded only as a site from which objects could be taken, but as a monument in its entirety. It was not only individual coins or weapons that were important, but the context, the course of the border, the location of the towers, the relationship between castles and settlements, the integration into the landscape. Today, the limes can be experienced again in many places, even if much has been reconstructed or is only visible as a terrain track. Reconstructed towers, replica palisades, museums, archaeological parks, and hiking trails help to make the old border comprehensible. Every reconstruction is always an approximation. It does not show the past itself, but an attempt to make it visible on the basis of research. Nevertheless, such places have a strong effect. If you stand in front of a reconstructed watchtower or walk along an old rampart, you get a feeling for distance, landscape, and perspective. It is easier to understand that the limes is not an abstract theme from books, but was once a real space in which people lived and worked. So what remains of the limes are not just stones and earth walls. It also remained a question. Why do people build borders? What are they supposed to protect? Who do they include? Who do they exclude? How do borders change the lives of the people who live near them? The Roman limes is old, but these questions still seem surprisingly modern today. Of course, you can't just equate ancient and modern borders. The political, legal, and technical conditions are completely different, but the basic tension remains understandable. Borders are never just lines. They are expressions of power, fear, order, identity, and control. The limes is also a reminder that even powerful systems are transient. What was once built with imperial authority, military discipline, and enormous effort was later abandoned, forgotten, demolished, and overgrown. A watchtower that was once part of a vigilant news network became a ruin. A fort where orders were given and soldiers were trained became a quarry or disappeared under fields. A border that once marked the end of Roman order became a ground monument. This transformation makes history tangible. It shows that power is not eternal, even if it tries to immortalize itself in stone. At the same time, the limes shows that transience is not the same as insignificance. Rome lost this border, but the traces of his actions remained visible for centuries. They shaped landscapes, awakened legends, kept researchers busy, and fascinate people to this day. The limes is therefore a place of remembrance. It is reminiscent of soldiers who stood on towers on cold mornings, to merchants who brought goods through controlled crossings, of families who lived in fortified villages, to Germanic neighbors who traded, negotiated, or fought with Rome, of emperors and commanders who believed they could order a landscape, and the silent truth that every order is tested at some point. It is particularly impressive that the limes no longer divides, but connects. What was once a border is now a shared cultural heritage. Regions, museums, researchers, and visitors deal with the same past. Hiking trails follow a line that used to mean control. People effortlessly cross places where soldiers once stood guard. A military border became a space of learning and remembrance. This reversal is perhaps one of the strongest meanings that have remained of the limes. The border has lost its old power, but it has gained a new role. In the end, more remained of the limes than its builders could have guessed. It was not the Roman rule that remained permanent, not the daily guard order, not the palisades in their original form. What remains are traces in the earth, stones in later walls, lines in the landscape, finds in museums, and stories in the memory. What has also remained is the realization that borders are always made by people and therefore always remain part of human hopes, fears, and claims to power. The limes is no longer a rim today. It is a window into the past. Through him we see an empire that wanted to show its strength, a frontier world full of life, and a landscape that tells us to this day that history never completely disappears. Chapter 15: The Limes as a World Heritage Site. Today, the limes is no longer a military border area, not a guarded line on the edge of an empire, not a place of Roman orders, patrols, and alarm signals. And yet it has not disappeared. It lives on as a monument, as an object of research, as a landscape trace, and as a reminder of a time when Rome tried to transform power, order, and security into stone, wood, and earth. What was once a border is now a shared cultural heritage. This transformation is remarkable. A system that was originally intended to separate, control, and monitor now connects people, regions, and sciences. The limes no longer only tells of Rome and its neighbors, but also of how modern societies deal with the past. As a World Heritage Site, the limes stands for a history that goes far beyond individual ruins. It is not just an old wall in the forest, not just a reconstructed watchtower, not just a fort ground plan under a meadow. Its significance lies in the context. Only the combination of towers, forts, streets, palisades, walls, ditches, settlements, and landscapes makes visible what Rome had created here. The limes was a system. This is precisely why its research and preservation is so demanding. You don't just have to protect individual sites, you have to understand entire historical spaces. A tower location can only be explained by its visual relationship to the next tower. A fort is explained by its location to the border, the road, and the hinterland. A ditch is not just a depression in the ground, but part of a political order. Recognition as a World Heritage Site means that the limes is not only of local or national importance. It is part of the history of Europe and at the same time part of the history of imperial border systems worldwide. The Roman Empire connected many regions, languages, cultures, and landscapes. Its borders ran through Britain, the Rhine, the Danube, North Africa, and the Middle East. The limes in Germany belongs to this larger network of Roman border policy. He shows how an ancient empire structured its peripheral zones and how it tried to deal with neighbors who were not completely under its rule. This makes the limes a key to understanding Roman power. But world heritage does not only mean fame. It means responsibility. The traces of the limes are sensitive. Many lie invisibly underground. Others are endangered by agriculture, development, roads, weather, or carelessness. A ground monument can last for centuries and then be damaged within a few days if its value is not recognized. That is why the limes needs protection, research, and education. Archaeologists, conservationists, historians, museums, communities, and volunteers are working to preserve these traces and make them understandable. They preserve not only old stones, but also connections. They protect a historic landscape. Modern research has greatly changed our image of the limes. In the past, it was often imagined as a simple line of defense against hostile Germanic tribes. Today he is seen in a more differentiated way. The limes was a border, but also a contact area. It was a military system, but also an economic area. It was a sign of Roman strength, but at the same time an expression of Roman limitation. Archaeological finds show how diverse life was there. Ceramics, coins, tools, weapons, inscriptions, building remains, and graves tell of soldiers, traders, women, children, craftsmen and veterans. They make it clear that history does not only consist of big decisions, but of the traces of everyday people. This is precisely why the Limes is so valuable for historical education today. He makes the past vivid. Anyone who only has an ancient border described in a book understands it differently than someone who walks along an old wall or stands in a reconstructed fort. The landscape itself becomes a textbook. You can see how far the view from a tower could reach. You can feel how laborious it must have been to transport material through forests and hills. You realize that a border is not abstract, but needs body, paths, effort, and organization. The Limes makes the Roman world tangible. At the same time, he invites us to ask questions that go beyond antiquity. Why do rich people build borders? What fears are behind this? What hopes? What does security mean for people living on a border? How does a border change trade, everyday life and identity? The Roman Limes is almost 2,000 years old, but these questions have not gone away. Modern societies also discuss borders, control, belonging and exchange. Of course, the Roman world was different. One should not simply equate ancient border fortifications with today's political borders. But the Limes helps to recognize basic patterns. Borders rarely arise only from strength. They often arise from uncertainty. They are supposed to protect, but at the same time they create new tensions. They divide, but they also create places of encounter. As a monument, the Limes is also a reminder of how transient power is. Rome was one of the most powerful empires in history. It built roads, cities, aqueducts, camps and borders. His emperors had themselves portrayed as rulers of an orderly world. But even this empire had to accept that its power was limited. The Limes marked this point. He showed where Rome no longer simply continued to expand, but had to secure, control, and weigh up. Later, its decline showed that even the best organization does not last forever when political stability, economic power, and military ability to act dwindle. Today, its remains stand still in the landscape, reminding us that every power, no matter how great it seems, will one day become history. But the Limes is not only a memorial to decay. It is also a testimony to human ability. He shows what organization, technique, and perseverance can achieve. The Romans surveyed landscapes, built roads, planned forts, erected towers, and created a communication system over long distances. They combined military necessity with administration and infrastructure. There is an enormous historical fascination in this achievement. The Limes was the work of many hands. Not only emperors and generals made it possible, but also soldiers, construction workers, craftsmen, surveyors, carters, farmers, and traders. World heritage, therefore, also means making these invisible people visible again. For the regions through which the Limes runs, it is now part of their identity. Hiking trails, museums, information boards, archaeological parks, and educational offers make it accessible. People visit places where watchtowers used to stand, walk along former borderlines, and discover that their home is part of a much larger history. A forest path suddenly becomes a Roman border section. A meadow becomes a former fort site. A hill becomes the vantage point of a soldier who may have been looking at the same horizon almost 2,000 years ago. Such experiences create proximity to the past. But this proximity also requires care. The past must not be simplified. The Limes was not simply a heroic story of Roman order, nor was it just a story of oppression. He was both and more. It was protection and control, encounter and demarcation, everyday life and power politics. It brought security for some and pressure for others. It facilitated trade, but it monitored movement. He showed Roman strength, but also Roman fear of the uncontrollable. A responsible approach to the Limes must preserve this complexity. Only then will the monument become more than a beautiful backdrop. In the end, a look at the Limes as a World Heritage Site leads back to the big question of this script. Was the Limes a symbol of strength or an admission of weakness? The answer probably lies precisely in the connection between the two sides. It was a symbol of strength, because only a highly organized empire could create such a border system. But it was also an admission of limitation, because Rome recognized that its power was not limitless. In this tension lies its real meaning. The limes shows an empire at the height of its power of order, and at the same time at the point where it had to learn to stop. Today we no longer need the limes as a border. We need it as a memory. It reminds us that history is inscribed in landscapes. He reminds us that power always requires effort. He reminds us that encounter and demarcation are often close together. And he reminds us that even the greatest empires leave traces that later generations have to reinterpret. A Roman line of control became a place of learning. A military system became cultural heritage. A border became an invitation to reflect on the past, present, and nature of power. The limes is therefore more than a monument from ancient times. It is a question for us. How do we deal with borders? What do we want to preserve? What stories do we tell about power and security? And what do we learn from an empire that believed it could order its world, but in the end had to recognize that every order has limits? This is exactly where the lasting power of the limes lies. He is no longer on the edge of the Roman world. Today it stands in the middle of our historical consciousness.